online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Live at 10, I'm Nadira Tudor. Djokovic will be deported. The tennis star loses his fight with the Australian government to stay in the country. Senior Tories slam Boris over alleged Downing Street parties as it's revealed the PM could be planning a mass clear-out of his team. And Prince Harry takes on the Home Office after he was stopped from paying for police protection in the UK. Novak Djokovic says he's extremely disappointed after losing a High Court bid to stay in Australia and the chance to defend his Open title. The tennis star had his visa revoked for a second time on Friday after the government there argued that his stance on avoiding COVID vaccines could bolster anti-vax sentiment in the country. Lawyers for the men's world number one had said a coronavirus infection last month meant he could legally enter. The 34-year-old now faces a 3-year ban on returning to Australia, but says he respects the ruling of the court. The Prime Minister must address the culture that led to Downing Street parties, according to the chairman of the Conservative Party, Oliver Dowden. The Times has reported that Boris Johnson could have a mass clear-out of his staff in a plan that the newspapers are calling Operation Save Big Dog. Changes could also include a ban on alcohol in Number 10 after revelations emerged of weekly wine time Fridays, which the Prime Minister was said to occasionally attend.
What matters to the British people is, first of all, they rightly expect us to get a grip of this situation. It was totally wrong, the events that happened. It's absolutely right the Prime Minister's apologised, and he will need to take further steps, and he will take those further steps when he makes a statement to the House of Commons.
Prince Harry seeking a judicial review against the Home Office over their decision not to allow him to pay for private security in the UK. The royal's legal representatives claim he wants to bring his son Archie and 7-month-old baby daughter Lilibet to visit from the US, but fears it's too dangerous. He wants to fund the security himself rather than ask taxpayers to foot the bill. Young people aged 16 and 17 in England will be able to book their booster jab from tomorrow. Around 40,000 teenagers will become eligible for the vaccine on Monday as the government moves into its latest phase of the programme. And former DJ Benjamin Alexander will become the first skier ever to represent Jamaica at the Winter Olympics. The 34-year-old says he was inspired to do so by the film Cool Runnings and that his story mirrors the movie after first taking up the sport in 2016. And your weather, sunny spells with the best of the sunshine over Scotland and Northern Ireland. Dry for most, but some early showers in the north, highs of 9 degrees. That's your live news on Talk Radio TV, more in half an hour.
Morning Talk.
Sunday Talk.
Talk Radio.
Richard Tice.
Powered by Debate.
Sunday morning with the Tice Man.
Richard Tice.
The heart of a common sense Sunday. Richard Tice.
Talk Radio.
And a very good morning to you. Welcome to Tice Talk here, Sunday the 16th of January. And I do hope wherever you are, wherever you're listening or viewing, it's a little bit less gloomy than here in central London. We can barely see out of the window for the grey, the fog, the gloom. But maybe that's what it's like in Downing Street this weekend. Because my big question to you this weekend, this show is, should Boris resign? My goodness me, what a week. It feels like a month has gone by since I was with you just last Sunday. Party, party, party. Imagine, the image, suitcases full of booze being dragged into Number 10. Goodness me, passing through the police scanners. Boris is definitely on borrowed time. The question is how much? We need to talk about China. We've got Spygate, extraordinary story. We've got Wuhan Labgate, yet more revelations. We've got PPE, cash and contracts. And then we need to talk about adult illegal migrants posing as children to increase their chances of staying here in the United Kingdom. Much, much more. We've got great guests. We've got MPs. We've got former MEP Anne Widdecombe. We've got Lords. We've got OBEs. We've got the lot. But my big question, I want your input, your views, your thoughts. Should Boris resign? And my other big question for you, and I'm going to be talking about this in my Sunday sermon, should we ban Chinese ownership of critical national infrastructure like nuclear power stations, like our electricity, like our gas, like our water? You know the number, 0344 499 1000. Text us 87222 using the word talk, or tweet at Talk Radio, and I'll read your tweets out. Keep them clean. It's a family show. And watch us, of course. Download the app, Talk Radio TV, or you can watch us on YouTube, Apple TV, Samsung, Roku, Rakuten. There really is no excuse not to watch and not to get involved. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It is Talk Radio.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio.
Well, a very warm welcome. And now is time for my Sunday sermon. And this, for me, is a really important moment. We have had this week a massive, humongous wake-up call about the influence of the Chinese communist regime in the heart of the British establishment. Yes, a Chinese lawyer who's been here for decades. Professional lady. Turns out she's a spy. It also turns out she's rather close to MPs and lords and politicians and the establishment. Yes, she's been donating huge sums to an MP in the Labour Party. She's previously donated money to someone in the Lib Dems. But let's just take a stage back. Imagine you're a key leader in the Chinese communist regime, part of the top leadership team, and you design a sort of two-part strategy, made in China and controlled by China. And you're taking, you see, a 50-year view, not a 5-year view like these democracies that have elections and things like that. No. You're taking a 50-year view, and you want as much as possible to be controlled by China. So you've got their Belt and Road Initiative, controlling rare earth resources in parts of Africa. But you also want to have massive influence in the decadent Western nations that spend their time talking about woke issues. And of course, the truth is, you don't want conflict, you want control, and you want to win the competition to become the biggest superpower. And we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, for decades, I've seen it in business. Chinese companies had a long track record of stealing intellectual property. They very often viewed joint venture partners from the West as the nearest, most foolish person to steal things from. It's been known that it's cost British companies hundreds of millions of pounds. One example, there was a break-in at an energy company in Scotland in 2011. And then that was just a couple of months after there had been a visit at that very same company by the Chinese vice premier and senior Chinese diplomats and senior Chinese business leaders. And just a couple of years later, guess what? A state-owned Chinese firm revealed equipment, technology, almost exactly the same as that was promoted by this company in Scotland. And this break-in at that Scottish company, sure enough, they stole laptops with designs on. But of course, maybe China didn't want a sort of James Bond-like spy jumping in from the roof lights or coming in the back door. Why would you bother doing that when actually you can come in the front door, which courteously is held wide open by some useful idiots of the British establishment, smartly educated at posh, expensive schools where you seem to be taught that you know everything and that perhaps rules don't apply to you. And it seems that all you have to do to get in with the British establishment is to bring a suitcase full, not of booze, but of cash, and just throw it around a few naive, greedy folk, whether they be from the city or politicians. I mean, just imagine dreaming as a Chinese leader of openly influencing the three main political parties of a Western nation. I mean, so we've got this week the news that Barry Gardiner, Labour MP, he's received over £500,000 in donations to his office. It turns out that the Liberal Democrat, Ed Davey, he was bunged to his office a few £1,000s back in about 2013, at a similar time that he was the coalition energy minister. And of course, what was China trying to do? They wanted to sell us solar panels. But also, it turns out, as energy minister, he was very involved in the decision to allow China to, and indeed the Chinese nuclear company, state-owned of course, to get heavily involved in a new nuclear power station at Hinkley Point. And this was welcomed by our Prime Minister, David Cameron, and Chancellor George Osborne. And extraordinarily, when Theresa May was appointed Prime Minister, and she had the temerity to actually just question that decision and to press the pause button, she received an absolute huge pressure from the establishment, who said the Chinese would be terribly upset, the French would be upset. She had ministers, lords, threatening to resign if she didn't proceed. So she proceeded to allow this Chinese nuclear company to be heavily involved in our new nuclear power station, including not just money, no, but Chinese engineers and supervisors. It seems hundreds of them involved in the construction. Unbelievable. And it appears that the United Kingdom is the only Western nation to allow the Chinese regime into our nuclear programme, a nuclear project. And Dave and George, oh yes, they wanted the Chinese nuclear company to get involved in more. Yes, they wanted them to not only fund a nuclear power station, they wanted them to design, build and operate a nuclear power station much closer to London. You couldn't make this stuff up. But this was what was called Operation Kowtow. Now, what else would you do if you want to gain a bit of prestige amongst the British establishment? I know. Why not appoint some knights, yes, some sirs and some lords to board positions of your UK subsidiary? That's exactly what happened with that company called Huawei. Yes, which sells telecom infrastructure equipment. And sure enough, under Dave and George and Theresa May, the plan was Huawei, a Chinese-owned company, to have telecoms equipment right at the heart of our critical telecoms infrastructure. And Boris wanted to do the same. Thankfully, and many people may not know this, but actually we've got Donald Trump to thank that that was stopped. Yes, because the United States and Australia would refuse to allow Huawei anywhere near their critical national infrastructure, and they insisted, they demanded that Boris drop that plan. But you see what's happened in the British establishment. Suitcases of cash has basically bought compliance. They bought the greedy, the great and the good from the city, and indeed former civil servants. Extraordinary. And then they've offered research grants to professors and doctors at our smart universities, like Cambridge and others. And of course they've guaranteed us a steady flow of high fee-paying students to these universities. And so you think, well, it's just money, 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 isn't it? But maybe actually strategic influence is really important. Protecting our critical infrastructure. The strategic national importance of the United Kingdom is above everything, but seems to have been forgotten by the British establishment. Cash to research institutes from China. And what happened was they got close to 3 British Conservative Prime Ministers, Cameron, May and Johnson. I'd like to understand the links between some of Boris Johnson's family. When Stanley Johnson, his father, is asked about China and asked to condemn things like the genocide of the Uyghur Muslims, he won't do it. No, he always talks about climate change. What are the ties between Boris Johnson's family and the Chinese regime? We should know these questions. It's important. It's at the heart of the British establishment. They've bought up huge chunks. Chinese companies have bought huge chunks of critical national infrastructure. They're the biggest single owner of our utility companies, and I think that's wrong. It's not allowed in the US. It's not allowed in France. And yet, when someone might have the temerity to stand up and criticise them, well, then things happen, don't we? I mean, we've had 5 Tory MPs last year were sanctioned by China for having the temerity to ask questions. I'll be speaking to one later this hour. When I stood up at a dinner for about 60 senior business folk a couple of months back in the centre of London, and I said that we shouldn't allow Chinese companies to own critical national infrastructure, Well, guess what? There were some very senior figures from a very large British bank, from their Asian subsidiaries. These are senior directors. They went absolutely nuts. They shouted at me in front of all these other leaders. Shameful, disgraceful, they said, for questioning this idea. Let me tell you what is shameful. Let me tell you what is disgraceful. And that is being a useful idiot, taking Chinese money and selling British interests, British strategic national interests, down the river to Chinese control. That is what is disgraceful. And what I think we should now have is a full inquiry into all Chinese funding of the British establishment over the last 15 years. We need to know what on earth has been going on. Here endeth my Sunday sermon. Now call me with your views, 0344 499 1000. Should Boris resign? Should there be a ban on Chinese ownership of critical national infrastructure? Text me, tweet me, you know the number. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
New. Best recipe ever. Talk radio.
Captivating, campaigning, controversial. Powered by common sense.
May cause mild irritation.
The word on the street. Standing up for the little guy.
Rewire your thinking.
Talk radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. Well, that was my Sunday sermon about the influence of the Chinese communist regime here in the heart of the British establishment. And after the news at the half hour, I'm going to be talking to Tim Lawton MP about this. He's one of the MPs that was sanctioned last year by the Chinese communist regime. I've got your tweets coming in already. Brexit Duck says, well done, Richard, for tackling the Chinese issue. Has our establishment been bought? Well, that is the big question. That's why I want an inquiry into this. We need to know. Now, I think it's John from Chingford says, no foreign entity, friend or foe, should own our utilities or industrial technology. And David says, do money laundering rules not apply to political donations? Had they done so, would this have been found out sooner? Really good question, David. And I'm not 100% sure to the answer to that. What I do know is that the donations to MPs and things and to political parties have to be declared with the Electoral Commission and the rules and things, and they generally have to be from a citizen that's on the electoral roll or from a UK trading company. That's my understanding. Anyway, it's a full-on show, and into the second hour, we've got Anne Widdecombe, former MEP, former MP for the Conservative Party. She's on the show to talk about Partygate. But now we're going to be talking to Talk Radio's political editor, Peter Cardwell, to discuss the big news, the suitcases full not of cash, but of booze. Peter, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. So, I mean, more revelations, more stories. How long does this go on, Peter? It seems like a sort of relentless drip, drip, drip. And I'm asking the key question this morning, Peter. Should Boris resign? And if so, when? What's your understanding? You're talking to lots of people, obviously, in the corridors of the House of Commons. We've got more MPs saying they've let letters in. What's your sense?
Yeah, I think this is dangerous but not critical for Boris Johnson. And that it appears to be how his team and he himself is dealing with this. We've got Tim Lawton, who you're talking to in a second, who is putting a letter in. Also, Lord Dunlop, possibly someone people haven't really heard of, but Andrew Dunlop was an absolutely key figure behind the scenes in the fight for the union at the Scottish referendum he's called for Boris Johnson to go. He was a minister in the Scotland office and the Northern Ireland office. So you've quite a number of, well, more like a big handful, I suppose, of people actually saying Boris Johnson should go. But certainly the message has been received. And I think it's going to be really interesting after the weekend, because all those MPs going back to their constituencies, talking to people, some of the inboxes with email have been horrendous from what I'm picking up, from people saying, occasionally people saying, leave him alone, he's made a few mistakes, but he's apologised. But the vast majority of people very annoyed with Boris Johnson from those inboxes from MPs I'm speaking to. But certainly the papers are full of speculation that what has been called, and I kid you not, Operation Save Big Dog, yes, really, is now in full flow. And it involves banning booze from Downing Street, probably not a bad idea, and a few other ways of throwing a bit of red meat to the Tory faithful. A couple of policies mooted that I would imagine the Talk Radio listenership would be pretty happy with. I know I am. Freezing the licence fee for the BBC, for example, that levelling up paper, working out how to help the north of England is hopefully out fairly soon as well. And there are a few other things up Boris Johnson's sleeve to try to reset his premiership. But whether he can do that or whether it's in terminal decline, we'll find out soon. But I think people are probably going to give him until May, the local council elections, which on polling at the moment could go very badly for the Conservative
Could go very
Party.
badly. But Peter, do we know when Sue Gray's report is likely to be published? I mean, obviously it seems that she's got more and more to investigate as more parties get revealed. Her report's going to get longer and longer. Is it a week? Is it a fortnight? Is it a month?
It'll be as long as it takes her. We've heard that it could be this week, but that was before we heard about a number of other parties. If she's got a sort of Excel spreadsheet, she's adding a few other columns to put in all those other parties. And of course, the revelations haven't finished yet. Nothing in the Sunday papers about new parties, but that doesn't mean they didn't happen, and it doesn't mean they won't emerge in the next day or two. So we could hear from Sue Gray this week, but my sense is it won't be this week. It could be in a couple of weeks. And until her report comes out, and until Boris Johnson can respond to her report, probably saying, yes, lessons need to be learned, things need to change, a few people need to resign, but not me, I'm the Prime Minister, I think that is not going to put an end to the problems that Boris Johnson is having. This is just going to drag on even further.
So I had a sense that he was going to sort of basically check out the mood of the party and the constituency associations over the coming days to see whether or not he could survive as long as the Sue Gray report. Your sense is clearly that he definitely survives until the publication of that report. And I guess maybe he might set out a strategy. If things are looking really bad for him, to buy himself a bit of time, Peter, he might say, I'll go after the May elections, because obviously, it takes 10 to 12 weeks, I think, doesn't it, for a Tory leadership contest. And obviously no new leader wants to come in and immediately be faced with the May elections.
Yes, that's right. And also the fact that a lot of people may find a Tory leadership election a bit self-indulgent at the moment in terms of how many things are happening. There's also the logistical issue of the fact that the people who get to the final two, probably Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, but we don't know for sure, would have to sort of tour the country. How would they do that necessarily with all the COVID restrictions? So I think a lot of
but they're all going to be released on the 26th, aren't they? That's part of his strategy. Release Plan B, Peter.
That's another thing that Boris Johnson is looking towards, which says to me, yet again, if Plan B is ended on the 26th of January, that so many of these restrictions were for political reasons rather than for health reasons. And guess what? Omicron wasn't nearly as virulent as the scientists would have us believe. Shock horror. But yeah, it's an interesting one. I think Boris Johnson is in serious trouble. He may announce he's leaving, but I think as soon as you announce you're going, the power just drains away and everybody moves on to the next person. And I think there's no clear successor. I don't get the sense that Rishi Sunak's campaign or Liz Truss's campaign are quite ready yet. No one has really stuck in the knife. We haven't. If you look on the bright side, if you look on sort of Boris Johnson's side of this argument, you've had no cabinet resignations. You've had no really properly senior MPs who really matter to him. Sorry, Tim Lawton, who have called for him to resign. And there doesn't seem to be. There's the scent of blood. The vultures are circling, but they haven't gone for him yet. So I think he'll probably will survive for a bit longer. The thing with Sue Gray's report as well, it's interesting because she has certain powers, but her remit is not to say, for example, that Boris Johnson broke what's called the ministerial code, which would mean he has to resign. So no matter what she writes in her report, there'll be no recommendation that the Prime Minister goes.
It's an advisory. It's an advisory report. Peter, can I just take you to this issue of Barry Gardiner and these donations from Christine Lee, because it's incredibly serious. And I really don't think it should just be allowed to be sort of swept under the carpet in amongst everything else. I mean, if this was a Tory MP, Labour would be calling for that MP either to be suspended or to resign. I'm not hearing quite as many calls from the Conservatives that Barry Gardiner, at the very least, should surely offer to take a suspension. I mean, the sums involved, it's not a couple of grand here and there. It's over £500,000.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a catastrophic error of judgment by Barry Gardiner and by the Labour Party. And I think there's a lot of anger about this. But politics is all about timing. And it's fascinating. I was talking to a corruption expert recently who said that, for example, the PPE scandal, the VIP lanes that certain people were in to get their personal protective equipment contracts into government, he said to me, that is a much bigger scandal than anything to do with Partygate. That deals with huge amounts of money. Similarly, with Barry Gardiner and the Chinese, and of course, a foreign government at the heart of Parliament, getting all sorts of institutions, meeting all sorts of meeting all sorts of senior people like the Prime Minister, Theresa May, being given an award for voluntary service, and speaking to something like 480 MPs about Chinese issues. So really, really worrying that there could be someone, and could there be more? Could there be more spies at the heart of our system as well? Because there have been other examples of MPs who've made errors of judgment.
And that's why actually, Peter, I'm calling for a full, big inquiry into all donations from Chinese companies or related entities to the heart of the British establishment, because I think there's a really worrying trend here. I think that they have been investing in huge chunks of the establishment, universities, think tanks, research institutes, lords on boards, knights on boards, former civil servants on boards, MPs. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. As you've just touched on, it's probably not just one. There could be a number of people. And this is right at the heart of us.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I'd probably add the Russians into that as well. There are foreign governments who will do anything they can to get influence at the heart of the system. You need to look at Cambridge University and Jesus College, for example. Charles Moore in The Spectator has done some really interesting journalism on this in terms of the influence and the fact that not only do the Chinese government take over institutions or attempt to take over institutions, but they then crush dissent and say that people can't criticize the Chinese government, who, of course, are torture people, murder people, the Uyghur Muslims, for example. And there is so much to look at here. So I think
there really is. I mean, we're talking to Tim Lawton. I got attacked by senior Asian directors of a British bank just before Christmas at a dinner for having the temerity to speak out against Chinese ownership of our critical national infrastructure. I was actually genuinely quite shocked.
Well, there's a thing in this country, which isn't in China, called free speech, Richard. And those people should absolutely not have been tackling you. If it was a friendly and reasonable debate, that's fine. But if they're actually attacking you, verbally, for speaking your mind, well, that's unacceptable.
It was pretty abusive. Peter, thank you so much for your thoughts. That's Peter Cardwell, Talk Radio's political editor, with his thoughts on all these issues. It's 10:30. Stay with us. Coming up after the break, we're going to be talking to Tim Lawton, MP, who's called for Boris Johnson to resign and who also has been sanctioned by China. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Here are your headlines. I'm Nadira Tudor. Djokovic will be deported. The tennis star loses his fight with the Australian government to stay in the country. Senior Tories slam Boris over alleged Downing Street parties as it's revealed the PM could be planning a mass clear-out of his team. And Prince Harry takes on the Home Office after he was stopped from paying for police protection in the UK. Novak Djokovic says he's extremely disappointed after losing a High Court bid to stay in Australia and the chance to defend his Open title. The tennis star had his visa revoked for a second time on Friday after the government there argued that his stance on avoiding COVID vaccines could bolster anti-vax sentiment in the country. Lawyers for the men's world number one had said a coronavirus infection last month meant he could legally enter. The 34-year-old now faces a 3-year ban on returning to Australia, but says he respects the ruling of the court. The Prime Minister must address the culture that led to Downing Street parties, according to the chairman of the Conservative Party, Oliver Dowden. The Times has reported that Boris Johnson could have a mass clear-out of his staff in a plan that the newspapers are calling Operation Save Big Dog. Changes could also include a ban on alcohol in Number 10 after revelations emerged of weekly wine time Fridays, which the Prime Minister was said to occasionally attend. Prince Harry seeking a judicial review against the Home Office over their decision not to allow him to pay for private security in the UK. The royal's legal representatives claim he wants to bring his son Archie and 7-month-old baby daughter Lilibet to visit from the US, but fears it's too dangerous. He wants to fund the security himself rather than ask taxpayers to foot the bill. That's your news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio.
World headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio. Listen on DAB+.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
Richard Tice. Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio, and keep the tweets and the messages coming in. We've got one here from William who says, why hasn't the BBC, why hasn't the BBC covered the Barry Gardiner story? Well, I don't know if they have or they haven't, but I'm certainly going to, because I think it's really important. I think the influence of the Chinese communist regime at the heart of the British establishment is a deep, serious concern, and I think we need a much broader inquiry into how far-reaching this is. This has been a huge, huge wake-up call for all of us. And we had a bit of a sort of a wake-up call last year when the Chinese regime decided to impose sanctions on a number of MPs from the House of Commons, as well as some others, for having the temerity and cheek to use what we call freedom of speech here in the United Kingdom to express concerns about, for example, the genocide of the Uyghur Muslims. And so I'm delighted to be joined by one of those MPs, Tim Lawton, MP for East Worthing and Shoreham, former Shadow Minister and indeed Minister in the Cameron years. Tim, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And in a sense, I'm really concerned, obviously, I think like many, about the Barry Gardiner revelations. But the reality is, Tim, that we've actually known about this for many years, haven't we? I mean, there was a story in the Times back in, I think, 2017. We knew about a much smaller donation to Ed Davey when he was a coalition energy minister. You sort of wonder, where does this start and where does this end, Tim?
Well, you're absolutely right to be concerned about this, Richard. And given all the publicity of various other things going on at the moment, we should not overlook the seriousness of this story. This is somebody who's been described by MI5, by our intelligence services, as an agent of influence, somebody about whom they are very concerned, which is why they wrote to all MPs last week, who has appeared to have her tentacles, and she represents the Chinese Communist Party government within Westminster, funding people that I see no reason or any connections between a Birmingham solicitor funding the office of a North London Labour MP to the tune of over $500,000, or funding a South West London Lib Dem MP who happened to be Energy Minister as well. How has this happened? How has her son, and I know nothing about how connected with her he is or not, been able to get presumably security clearance for a pass to be a researcher within the House of Commons working for Barry Gardiner as well? This is deeply worrying, and many of us, particularly those 7 parliamentarians who've been sanctioned, of which I wear mine as a badge of honour by the Chinese government, have been warning for ages. We need to have a full and thorough audit of exactly where those tentacles of the Chinese Communist government extend to, through British institutions, through boardrooms, through university campuses, through schools, through infrastructure projects, and now even in the House of Commons, it would seem.
And that's what I'm calling for, because, I mean, for example, I checked on the UK subsidiary board of Huawei, which very nearly got away with putting in key critical infrastructure into our 5G telecoms network. They've got 3 sirs and 1 lord on their board, including the great and the good from the City of London and a very senior former civil servant. Now, thankfully, that got stopped thanks to the US rather than the government. But I mean, this just really worries me. And I think we do need that level of inquiry. I know, for example, Tim, you had a debate on another radio channel, I think in early December, with Richard Burgon, the Labour MP. And he would not in any way condemn anything about the Chinese regime to do with the Uyghur Muslims. And you pushed him really hard. And that struck me as worrying at the time. And maybe now we know the reason why.
I think that debate was extraordinary. I mean, there was a Labour MP who happened to be a shadow cabinet minister under Jeremy Corbyn, who would not say a single word of criticism against China, given everything that has come out about the horrendous human rights abuses that the House of Commons has voted on, that it was genocide that is still being committed within Xinjiang province against the Uyghurs, with all the evidence that me and others have brought out against their abuse against the Tibetans as well, what's going on with the oppression in Hong Kong, the snuffing out of free speech. And yet, every time you asked Richard Burgon to challenge that and to raise criticism, it was, all the human rights abuses that the Americans are committing, or that the West is responsible for, the UK is responsible. I mean, it was hugely unbalanced.
It was extraordinary and deeply worrying. We need Tim to talk about sanctions, because at some point we've got to say, actually, enough is enough. And I think you've talked previously about sanctions. Should we, for example, continue to allow basically a state-owned nuclear subsidiary of the Chinese regime to have an equity stake and significant funding and engineers on the ground at Hinkley Point? And what's the latest understanding that you've got about what their involvement may or may not be with the proposed nuclear power station at Bradwell?
Well, you're right, Richard. Again, that's why I've asked for an audit across the board, because China has been very big investors in infrastructure projects, not just in the UK, but around the world, but increasingly in Western countries as well. They've been buying companies, often in quite sensitive technology and defence-linked areas. They fund research on many of our university campuses and are big funders of university campuses, again in projects that are in sensitive areas. That do we really want to be sharing that technology and that IP with the likes of China, whose intentions towards us are, I'm afraid, not always benign, as you know. Now, the government has started waking up to this, I'm glad to say, helped by those of us who raised the alarm over Huawei, who got that genocide vote through the House of Commons. And we've got sanctions against a few officials. We've now got measures preventing British companies from dealing in Xinjiang if there's any chance that might be involved with genocidal slave labour camps. But we need to go a lot further than this. There's a bill that's going through Parliament at the moment that has made it easier to finance some of these large infrastructure projects, such as nuclear, without having to rely on large overseas powers with huge pockets like China. That's a good move. But we need to be sanctioning more of their people, particularly those responsible for the genocide in Xinjiang. We need to be placing a default clause, as the Americans have just done, that they need to prove that things that we are buying from China, particularly in Xinjiang province, are pucca, effectively. They're not produced by slave labor. They're not produced as a result of genocide. The onus should be on China to prove that the things we are buying from them are produced in a legitimate way, in just the same way that you, I, others may want to buy things that are environmentally friendly, and you increase and you get that, the green credentials are trotted out and people look for that. I look for single thing I buy to make sure it's not bought in China if I can possibly avoid that. So we need governments to wake up. We need everybody else to wake up. And China needs to be called out, and we need to take action at long last.
And you see countries like the US, Tim, and France, they don't actually allow overseas ownership without government approval of critical national infrastructure. And that would include, for example, nuclear power stations, but it would also include things like electricity companies, gas companies, water companies. And yet my research shows me, for example, that Chinese companies are actually the biggest single owners of our utility companies. And, I'm thinking this is ultimately they end up winning the competitive game by controlling absolutely key parts of UK infrastructure. And this can't be right.
Well, the threshold in other countries is high. It's not entirely right that they can't buy into those projects. And I'm afraid there are many Chinese technology companies in the US who are suspected of tapping into information and taking that back to Beijing as well. But you're right. We need to have a much more transparent look at exactly what the Chinese are capable of and what they are up to, because I'm afraid their intentions are highly questionable. But they're very smart. They've been doing this under the radar for many, many years. I was at a conference recently with many other sanctioned MPs from around the world, and we had presentations about now the Chinese government, for example, through their various companies and agents, now control at least 104 ports around the world. Now, this is a serious impact on the supply chain that's now in the hands of the Chinese. They've got a stranglehold on many rare minerals that are essential to technology, particularly electric technology for electric cars and things like that. They're controlling mines in Africa. I mean, this is a huge operation that the Chinese have very cleverly been getting on for years.
And this is their strategy. It's either made in China or it's controlled by China. And I fear that that's one of the reasons that they're so focused on re-establishing the tie with Taiwan, because Taiwan, of course, has the world's biggest semiconductor company, and indeed a subsidiary of a Chinese company is actually looking to buy a Welsh semiconductor company as we speak. But I'm pleased that actually under the National Investment and Security Act that's recently come into force, I think a couple of weeks ago, the government does now have the ability to block that. Is that something that you and colleagues will have made representations to the Business Secretary about?
We've already called for that, so it's come up several times, and I'm pleased that these new powers under the Act, which is also the new measures going through about how we finance some of these infrastructure projects as well, will make it much harder for China to be able to, under the radar, extend its influence. Look, we've just got to get smarter to this. I'm afraid governments in the past have been afraid to call out China because we have relied on their cheap goods and their investment too much. I think if the pandemic has shown anything, it's shown that we need to have security of supply chains, and we should not be relying on dodgy countries on the other side of the world that don't have our best intentions at heart.
Absolutely, and we need to be really focused on this. We need much more self-reliance. And in a sense, all the shenanigans in number 10, Tim, it actually clouds this massively important issue of strategic national security. Yeah. And look, whatever happens with Boris Johnson, and I know you put your views clearly forward, we haven't got time, unfortunately, to talk about that with you this morning, but I'm talking about it with others. But this is such an important issue. I really do hope that you and your colleagues will keep banging the drum because it's in our interests, and I think it's vital that we do have a proper open inquiry into the regime's funding of the British establishment. Tim Lawton, thank you so much for coming on this morning. Really appreciate it. That was Tim Lawton, MP for East Worthing and Shoreham and former minister, with his views about the Chinese regime. And of course, he was sanctioned last year by the regime for having the temerity to express his views using freedom of speech here in the United Kingdom. Give us a call, 0344 499 1000. Don't hold back. Keep those views coming up. We've got lots coming in already. We've got one here from Jeanette, who says, totally agree about China. What about all the lateral flow tests that were made in China, possibly by slave labour? Well, I don't know about that. But that's the point. It's either made in China or it's controlled in China. And I don't think it's smart. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV. The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
They can take away your opinion. They can't take away your freedom of speech.
100% more beat. Smart people, smart thinking.
We say what you think.
Talk Radio, the home of common sense.
Welcome back to Tice Talk, and it's not only the home of free speech, but it's also the home of proper speech. And I'm very grateful to Graham, who has tweeted in, and he says the pronunciation of this region in China is really important. It's not Xinjiang, it is, according to Graham, and I'm going to try and hopefully get this right, it is Xinjiang. Graham, I hope I've got that right. If not, send us another tweet. We've got other tweets coming in. Carl, he says foreign countries should not be allowed ownership of our critical infrastructure. Mitch says yes, there should be a full public inquiry. And Stan, he says, agreed, the British establishment are easily seduced by Chinese money and funding. I think I'm onto something here. I think this is really important, and we've got to have the courage to keep talking about it. And Lynn from Staines reminds us, as if we could forget, that COVID originated from China. I can't believe it was deliberately, but anyway, deliberate or not, she says, it's, what is coming next? Well, we know what's coming next. They want to control us. That is the thing. And of course, they sold us all the PPE, and we're going to be talking later in the programme about these PPE contracts. We've got some calls. We've got Matthew in Bolton. Good morning, Matthew. How are you doing? What's your view on all of this?
Good to listen in to the story with Barry Gardner, because it's like many other stories are going on at the minute. He won't be the only one, I'm sure, who's employing potential undercover spies, because if there's one, they found one, the likelihood is there's more. And his response up to now, to me, hasn't been adequate.
Do you think he should? Do you think then, Matthew, that he should essentially be suspended pending a proper inquiry? I think by the Standards Commissioner.
Well, I'm losing track, Richard, of all these inquiries because,
like me,
like, it's like you're marking your own homework again. You've just said about this, the lady who's investigating the parties. She can't force Boris to resign, or unless it's the ministerial code. But she's not even reviewing that. So what's the point of this investigation? We've seen the pictures. We know there was parties. So what's the hold-up?
Well, I think we know what the hold-up is on the Sue Grade inquiry. It's to try and buy a bit of time for the Prime Minister to see if he can dig himself out of a hole.
How much is that costing, Richard, the taxpayer, all these inquiries?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, as I understand, she is an existing civil servant, so she's on a salary. So in a sense, hopefully it shouldn't cost that much. But you're absolutely right. Are they marking their own homework? That's a good question. I think with Barry Gardner, though, the Standards Commissioner is a separate independent person. I'm not 100% sure exactly who that is, but I think it's better to have the information so that there's transparent understanding of what's gone on.
The president's been set the ones, isn't it, this week? Is it Claudia Webb?
Claudia Webb, yes, the Labour MP for, I think it's Leicester East.
So she's back in Parliament on a pending an appeal, I believe.
That's as I heard, yes. Which I was
it's not
gobsmacked
acceptable,
about.
Richard. These people are meant to be setting an example to the rest of us, and it's turning into a laughing stock, really.
It feels like that. It almost feels like they're rubbing their nose in it, rubbing our noses in it. I mean, the idea, for example, that Claudia Webb could come back and be in the House of Commons, having been convicted as she was, is the barefaced cheek of it, frankly.
Yeah, it's different if it's... So has a decision been made on her? She was found guilty.
Well, she was found guilty, but obviously she has the right to appeal, and she's expressed that right. But again, it's it's the very cheek of it. I think is the issue. But I mean, you think that there should be therefore an inquiry into Barry?
Oh yeah, we should just have a permanent 24/7 rolling programme of inquiries, because there's plenty of stuff to inquire about with how many rules and laws are being broken. I think also, I'm not sure with this country, Great Britain, what is the reluctance to have discussions about national security? Because a lot of people, when you bring up national security, they want to close it down. Tobias Elwood's been covering this about China.
Absolutely.
For weeks and weeks and weeks.
Exactly. Matthew, thank you so much for those thoughts. I'm going to go now to Simon, who is in Basingstoke, I think. Simon, good morning.
Good morning, Richard. I think we should all be much more concerned about China than our elites are, who have been doing far too well for too long from Chinese money. I actually work in cybersecurity, and I've noticed over the last 2 months a dramatic increase in the number of roles for the MOD and for companies connected to the MOD. I'd say it's increased by a factor of 10. So my theory behind that is that there's obviously been a very, very serious data breach, especially from the nature of roles that have been advertised, and that our government is keeping quiet about it. And if there has been a serious data breach, then I would bet a lot of money that it's actually been committed by a state actor, and that state actor is China.
Well, I don't know about that. So you've seen advertisements for new data jobs at the MOD. Specifically, cybersecurity roles, which you have to be SC cleared or DV cleared to have, that are specifically looking to address the sort of issues that you would address if you've had a major data breach. And I'm really surprised, because these are all public records, these are all publicly advertised roles, and I'm really surprised no one in the press has picked up on it. So that raises concerns with you. And Simon, just tell me, where are you on the issue of Boris and Partygate?
I think, to be honest, the issue for me is, why be that stupid? Anyone that stupid you wouldn't employ them in your company. You wouldn't, let alone let them run the country. How did they ever expect to keep that quiet? But I think the China issue is far more significant. China is going to be a very dangerous country over the next few years because of the the complete collapse that's happening in its property market, in which 75% of its savings, of its extremely hard workers have been placed. So China is going to be looking to have an external threat that it has to deal with to distract its people from the fact that they've lost the wealth they've worked so hard for in the last 30 years. So China is going to be a very dangerous power. In fact, I would say it's a race to see which collapses first economically, China or the United States.
Yes, I'm not sure I share that in terms of an economic collapse. I think they're very clever, and they've got huge resources and, of course, the ability to print money, and they're very clever at sort of disguising things that go wrong. But without question, they want, and they think so long term, Simon, and they want ultimate control. And Simon, just before we get to the top of the hour, Barry Gardiner, inquiry, should he be suspended?
He should be suspended, and it shouldn't be a parliamentary standards inquiry. It should be an inquiry by either MI5 or Special Branch, because you need to go through his financial records to see what monies he's received, and then see if that's had any impact on the votes he's made.
Absolutely right. Well, that's I agree with you. There definitely should be. He should actually suspend himself, really, given what's been exposed and declared. Simon, thank you for so much indeed. That was Simon from Basingstoke with his thoughts on what's going on. It looks as though from Graham, this running issue about how to pronounce the region. I've still got it wrong. I'm going to give Graham a call after the show to get it right before embarrassing myself any more live on air. But we've got other tweets coming in. We've got one from Tom in Stockport who says, "We can't have such an idiot as Boris in charge when we have to deal with China. Both are as serious as each other." That's a good point. Janet says, "Are we still going ahead, going to the Olympic Games? Just doesn't make sense to Janet." Well, that's another good point. Stay with us. Coming up in the second hour, Anne Widdecombe. There'll be no nonsense there. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV. The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
5 at 11, I'm Nadira Tudor. Deporting Djokovic. The tennis star loses his fight with the Australian government to stay in the country. Labour leader slams Boris Johnson over alleged Downing Street parties as it's revealed the PM could be planning a mass clear-out of his team. And how the film Cool Runnings inspired this man to become Jamaica's first ever Winter Olympic skier. Novak Djokovic says he's extremely disappointed after losing a High Court bid to stay in Australia and the chance to defend his Open title. The tennis star had his visa revoked for a second time on Friday after the government there argued that his stance on avoiding COVID vaccines could bolster anti-vax sentiment in the country. Lawyers for the men's world number one had said a coronavirus infection last month meant he could legally enter. The 34-year-old now faces a 3-year ban on returning, but the Prime Minister says the decision will keep Australians safe. The Labour leader says the Prime Minister broke the law when he allegedly attended Downing Street parties during lockdown. Sir Keir Starmer has also accused Boris Johnson of lying in the House of Commons during the scandal. It comes as the Times reports that Boris Johnson is set to have a mass clear-out of his staff and ban alcohol consumption in Number 10 in a shake-up designed to save his premiership.
But I think it's pretty obvious what's happened. There's industrial-scale partying that's been going on at Downing Street. Not much of it is really denied, and I think that the public have made up their mind. I think the facts speak for themselves. I think the Prime Minister broke the law. I think he then lied about what had happened.
Prince Harry is seeking a judicial review against the Home Office over their decision not to allow him to pay for private security in the UK. The Royals' legal representatives claim he wants to bring his son Archie and 7-month-old baby daughter Lilibet to visit from the US, but fears it's too dangerous. He wants to fund the security himself rather than ask taxpayers to foot the bill. Young people aged 16 and 17 in England will be able to book their booster jab from tomorrow. Around 40,000 teenagers will become eligible for the vaccine on Monday as the government moves into its latest phase of the programme. And former DJ Benjamin Alexander will become the first skier ever to represent Jamaica at the Winter Olympics. The 34-year-old says he was inspired to do so by the film Cool Runnings and that his story mirrors the movie after first taking up the sport in 2016. And your weather, sunny spells with the best of the sunshine over Scotland and Northern Ireland. Dry for most, but the chance of showers to the north later, highs of 9 degrees. That's your live news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Sunday Talk.
Good talk. News talk.
Talk Radio.
The Tice Man cometh.
Stir up your Sundays with Richard Tice.
From global current affairs to the issues that hit closer to home.
Richard Tice.
On Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. We're into the second hour and it's hard to know where to start. But the key word seems to be suitcases. Yes, suitcases. Why, you think? Well, normally you might think when you talk about people being potentially open to influence, suitcases of cash, and then you've got the issue of suitcases of booze. It's hard to know where to go with this, but someone who's always got a clear, strong view on matters is my next guest. And I'm delighted to be joined this morning by the former Conservative MP, former Brexit Party MEP, Anne Widdecombe, for Anne's thoughts on what's going on in Number 10 and around. Anne, a very good morning to you. Thanks for being with us. How are you? Are you reeling from what's going on in Number 10 and around Westminster? I mean, where do we start, Anne?
Right, morning, Richard. No, I'm not reeling, and I think we need to keep clear heads about this. First of all, when Boris said he thought it was a work event, my immediate reaction was that it was so stupid. But then when I considered it further, I thought these are people who've been working together all day. They've been doing that for months on end. And they decide to meet this time not with a file in their hands, but with a glass in their hands to say goodbye to a colleague or whatever it might be. Boris was asked to come out and thank people. And I don't suppose for one moment that they put that in quite the same category as organising a do for Sunday lunch or something. Nevertheless, that much said, I think somebody there should have thought about it. And this is what is really lacking. Boris doesn't appear to have anybody behind the scenes thinking for him, saying, hang on, Prime Minister, how might that appear? He hasn't got that. He's disorganised, he's dishevelled, he's everything. And it's just time that he had somebody taking charge behind the scenes, and that ain't Carrie.
And I get that point. People are working very hard and they just want to sort of just relax for a bit. I think everybody gets that. It was the fact that there was an email with an invitation to a socially distant sort of I think it was a Friday, bring your own booze. It was clearly an organised event, and then you've got issues of sort of bringing in a fridge. It just feels a culture, Anne, of one rule for them and a different rule for everyone. And the thing that gets me is the insensitivity. They obviously weren't afraid of the virus, and yet they were telling all of us that we couldn't say goodbye to our loved ones who were dying, we couldn't go to their funerals. That, I think, is what's winding the public up.
Oh, certainly what winds me up is the fact that they were making judgments, which I think were actually perfectly sound judgments, that they weren't, if you look at the pictures of that party in the garden, there was miles between the different groups. And I think they made judgments. And I don't necessarily disagree with those judgments. But the issue is what you've just pointed out, which is that we weren't allowed to make those judgments. I mean, I tried as far as I could to make my own judgments throughout all the whole process. And if only they'd allowed the public, advised them strongly what to do, but then allowed the public to make its own best judgment, then we wouldn't have the problem we've got now. However, onto the bigger issue, should he resign? No. This is the worst possible moment. Now, there's never a good moment to resign, but we're in a situation where we're coming out of a pandemic, a completely unforeseen pandemic. We've had the impact on the economy of that. We've got numerous problems with Brexit. And I would say to you, Richard, beware. I heard you calling for Boris's resignation. You might get a Remainer in instead, so beware. And we've got Brexit to sort out. And those two things alone, before everything else, mean that this is not the time to plunge the country. Not thinking of the party now, I'm thinking of the country. The country into months of uncertainty, which is what a leadership election involves. How will the EU negotiate over Northern Ireland if they don't know who the PM is going to be? How will the civil servants implement long-term policy? They don't know who the PM is going to be. Just let's stay calm, shall we?
But do you see, given where the polls are, Anne, do you see that if he survives until the May elections, and obviously, in a sense, the Tory leadership campaign, if there was one, is many weeks long. It's sort of 10 to 12 weeks on a normal time frame, as I understand. If the Tories do very badly in that May election, do you see then that people might say, actually, now it's time? Because ultimately, the Tory party it's an election winning machine, and if they think that he's not going to win the next election, then they won't hang around, will they?
I think the May elections will be important. What is not important to the opinion polls now? I could point to a time in, say, 2013 when Labour was with its strongest lead for years and years. What happened 2 years later? They lost the election. And so when you actually try to take a long-term perspective, what the opinion polls show now is not necessarily what they're going to show in 3 years' time. But in May, of course, you have the elections. And what you end up with, if you have an absolute slaughter, as Theresa May found out, if you have a slaughter at the polls in May, people are very, very angry because it is, and it's something that I've observed for years, the troops in the country think they're at action stations, they're fighting, and the officers brawling in the mess. And that is what infuriates them. And I think, therefore, you might get a very bad reaction if the polls go against us in May. But there's a lot of time between now and May.
There is without question, and you're quite right. There's, in a sense, there's always going to be things to sort out with Brexit, because actually trade between two entities, two countries, it's always subject to future reviews and negotiations. And let's see where Liz Truss gets to with it. She's written and talked tough. The question is whether she actually acts tough in the negotiations. Over the next few weeks. I would like to see her, Anne, set a clear deadline to these negotiations rather than drip, drip, drip. I mean, Lord Frost tried, but perhaps he resigned because he wasn't happy that Boris would take the big, tough decision to invoke Article 16.
Well, he resigned on many grounds, not least high tax and high spend. But you're absolutely right. What we lack is the deadline. We hear a lot of bold talk, but we don't actually have deadlines. We've heard bold talk for a long time before Liz Truss was in charge of it. We're always hearing bold talk. So we need a deadline. And Liz Truss needs to say that if by and I pluck it out of the air. The 31st of March, I just pluck that out of the air. There is no progress or nothing that we would recognise as progress. Then Article 16. But without a deadline and just a vague threat in the air,
yes.
Why would the EU believe us? When do they ever believe us?
Well, because in a sense, we've never acted tough enough. We've never really given an indication that we would walk away. I think actually Lord Frost was possibly the only person that they thought might genuinely be prepared to walk away. And now, sadly, he's walked away, as you say, on many grounds.
I think that's absolutely true. I think he might have done. On the other hand, Liz Truss has got quite a lot of steel in her. I mean, she's come out this week supporting the PM, which is an unpopular position to take within the party. Rishi Sunak just ran for cover. Liz Truss actually stood up and stood behind her general, and I rather admire that. So she may have the guts to do this, but I don't see any sign at the moment that the EU believes that we will take unilateral action, and that goes right back, as you and I know, to the days of, should we have no deal? Of course we should have had no deal, and all this would have been sorted out by then.
That's right. Whilst you've been speaking, Anne, just thinking about Boris, I've got a tweet message coming. It says, Remainers within the Conservatives want for Boris Johnson as a party member, says, I would support Boris as long as he reversed his green taxes and national insurance increases and sorted out the Northern Ireland border and illegal crossings. It's quite a long list there. I mean, it is a long list of issues, but Boris has got to show some real courage.
I agree, but it's because of those issues that are floating around at the moment, particularly the Northern Irish one, that I think this is not a time to plunge the country into 12 weeks or possibly even more of uncertainty. It really isn't. But I think he's right. I mean, he's picked on the right issues. Green taxes. We did not vote when we contribute in this country 1% to all the world's emissions, 1 miserable percent. And yet we're absolutely putting an enormous burden on individual citizens to change their boilers and to do this and to get a certain type of car. 1%. It's like throwing a sugar cube into Loch Ness and saying, oh, look how sweet the water's.
You're absolutely right. Well, when I was pounding the streets of Bexley and Sidcup, Anne, I can tell you that the simple slogan, Save Our Boiler, went down very well indeed. Before I let you go, Anne, could I please just get your thoughts on the Barry Gardiner revelations and Christine Lee and the implications for this? And should Barry Gardiner essentially stand down pending this inquiry? I'm quite sure if it was a Conservative MP that had received that sort of level of funding, the Labour Party would be calling for a suspension at the very least.
Well, I think a lot depends on what declarations have already been made about that funding, where it was perceived to have come from, etc. I think, and I have always said this, I am a great believer in the principle, whether it's Tory, Labour, it doesn't matter who it is. I'm a great believer in the principle, innocent until proved guilty. But if he is proved to have taken something from questionable sources, knowing that they were questionable, and there's that, then of course he should stand down, he should resign. Yeah.
In a sense, yes, and of course, actually, as I understand from everything that's been written, he's declared these donations over a long period of time, and therefore, in a sense, everybody knew.
Everybody knew. Yeah.
And therefore, as you say, the key question is in a sense, what was the source of the donations and the person behind it and where the money came from behind it?
That is the issue. The greater issue is the Chinese trying this sort of thing on at all. I mean, I think we all know, as we did in the days of the Cold War, we all know that big foreign powers who are ambitious will go in for this sort of thing. But this seems to have gone on for a very long time.
Well,
it's been amazingly blatant.
Well, in my Sunday sermon that I give, and as you know, I'm not a person of the cloth, Aaron, but my monologue I call a Sunday sermon first thing. I've called for a full inquiry into Chinese funding of large parts of the British establishment, because I am actually really concerned about it. It just seems to have so many reaches, and in a sense, it's that simple slogan, it's either made in China or controlled by China, and I'm worried that large parts of our establishment have got themselves into hot water.
Oh, I think that's quite true, and don't forget while we're at it that Russia controls our gas. So, we have those problems, and again, I don't think that Boris has got the eye for detail on that sort of thing. And that is why it is so crucial that he has somebody at his elbow who is a micromanager with a very close eye for detail, who will point things out to him, which I don't think necessarily, people are doing at the moment.
And thank you very much indeed for that. And you've got a great fan here, and a tweet has just come in and smashes it again. Such a very sensible and clear-thinking lady. That was from Peter in Stevenage. And thank you very much for your thoughts. That was Anne Widdecombe, clear as ever, no nonsense. And Peter certainly agrees. But send us your tweets, your thoughts, your calls, 0344 499 1000. Anne Widdecombe does not think that Boris Johnson should resign, but should have a clear out of some of his team, get better people underneath him, and reset large parts of his agenda. Well, I want your views on that. Don't hold back. 0344 499 1000. Lots of messages always coming in. There's another one here. Anne is always right. Goodness me. There we are. We've got lots of people supporting Anne and her thoughts. And another one here from Joanne, saying, well done for tackling the China issue. We need to understand they are not our friends and will do whatever they can to give themselves an edge over there. Well, that's the point, isn't it? They're always looking to gain the competitive edge, and that's by making things cheaper in China, but then also controlling through the Belt and Road Initiative and through owning companies and critical national infrastructure all around the world. That's how they end up controlling us. Give us a call. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV. The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
Bold, brave, ballsy.
Made to make your mouth water.
A radiant force of argument.
Shape up and talk.
Freedom of speech.
Accept no substitutes.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. Well, that was Anne Widdecombe with very clear, no-nonsense views on what Boris Johnson should do. He should stay, but he needs a new team and he needs to get on with his agenda, in particular in terms of Northern Ireland. That was Anne Widdecombe. Thanks for that. Keep the tweets and calls coming in. We've got one here From Alison, who says, some media companies and universities take money for research, all then open to bribery by the donor. It's not just political parties, especially when you have multi-billionaires trying to influence policies. That's my point, is that we need to understand the extent of these donations in an open and transparent way. Sometimes there can be genuine good intention, of course, but equally at other times it may be a question of seeking influence. And we have to understand the risks and the opportunities in an open, transparent basis, and then we get some balance, then we get some understanding, and we all know where it is. We've got Brendan in Hartlepool. Good morning to you, Brendan. What are your thoughts this morning?
Good morning, Richard. Good to speak to you again. I've spoken to you a couple of times.
That's right, yes, indeed.
I met you at Park Drive as well. I actually campaigned for you.
Thank you, Brendan. Good man.
Now I'm coming on that in the later. Right, I think, but the party things, I think is a complete shit. Nobody, I have a job that goes up and down the country. Nobody's bothered about the parties, apart from people who don't like Boris and want rid of him. So I don't think that's going to go along. But what I do think he should go is with his silly green agenda, his zero carbon agenda, the Northern Ireland thing, the immigration policy. That's where he should go. Now, if he can get them, if he somehow hangs on and then gets rid of his, dumps some of the things that we never voted for when we elected him, because I must admit, after we lost in Hartlepool, the next election I voted Tory, and Jill got in.
Indeed. So let me ask you, so you're saying that actually, as long as he can change some of his policy positions, then he should stay. So you're going up and down the country, Brendan, and you're saying people are not worried about parties. That's not what I'm hearing, but nevertheless, I'll stick with that.
We'll agree.
But hear me out. So what are people saying about net zero? How many people that you talk to are aware of and understand the implications of net zero?
Quite a lot are aware of the cost it's going to cost, and the ordinary man in the street can't afford $9,000 for a ground heater and stuff
for a heat pump. And have most people heard of this expression, net zero?
Yeah, the ones that I talk to people, and they seem to agree that yes, they have heard of it. And the other thing, we can't all afford 40, 50, 60,000 pound electric cars either. And how are we going to produce the electricity for them? If we aren't, wind
exactly.
Doesn't work very often. Rolls-Royce's new mini nukes, they're probably a good idea. Hydrogen is the way forward, but that's another thing. He hasn't done any of that yet. Apart from Ben Houchin up here, he's getting a hydrogen plant built in Tice.
That's right. There's lots of great new technologies coming forward, and I'm a great fan for investing them. But you need a diverse range of technologies, because what you don't know is which one's going to succeed, at which time frame, and at what price. So you need to be investing in a whole wide range of them, but fundamentally, until then, the one thing you know is that gas is here. It's available. You can turn it on and off. It used to be cheap, but sadly now at the moment it's not, because we're exposed to Putin's shenanigans. But that's another story.
Actually, sorry, can I disagree? Apparently, North Sea gas they have to sell it at world prices for some reason. I don't know why, but I mean, do you think that's stupid? If we produce, it has to be sold at whatever the prevailing price. And also, how much shale gas are we sitting on?
Well, that's the point. So I'm a big advocate of shale gas, because that's free gas that's owned by all of us, literally under our feet, Brendan.
Exactly.
The point about the world markets is that the people are basically extracting, for example, the gas in the North Sea. They'll sell it on world markets unless they've previously contracted, for example, with the UK government, to sell it on a long fixed-term contract to the country in order to make sure, or to generators, to make sure that we're supplying. What's interesting though is that in the US, where they're extracting huge quantities of shale gas, Brendan, guess what? Their gas prices are a fraction of ours here in the UK. So they're not exposed to world prices, because they're extracting their own gas, and they've got clearly medium-term contracts to supply US citizens.
I thought Biden's knocked shale gas on the head. I thought their energy costs. I mean, the petrol costs in America are a whole $4 a gallon. God, Christ knows what ours would be if we priced ours per gallon.
Well,
we £1.50 a litre.
It's unbelievable. Brendan, thank you so much for those thoughts. That was Brendan in Hartlepool. We're going to go down from Hartlepool in the north very dear to my heart, down to Ashford in Kent. I think that's the Ashford. Lenny, good morning to you. Are you in Ashford in Kent? And what would you like to say?
Ashford in Kent, Richard.
Lovely spot. I know it well.
Yeah, we just took to put you in the picture regarding PPE. I purchased for all my family to protect them their masks in January 2020.
Right, you were right on the ball then, Lenny. You were well ahead of the curve.
Yes, and all it was, I found out that the Chinese had stopped exporting PPE. So I knew it was going to be short, and I phoned all my cousins and I said, go and buy your mask. I said, they're going to be short. And that's what I did. Now, if I did that, and I was in business all my life, and if I could see that coming, why could not the government?
Well, it's a very good question, Lenny. And I think there's probably multiple answers. I don't really know. Of course, we were being told at the time, in I think it was March and April, by some of the scientists and the people leading the government, that we shouldn't be wearing masks, that they wouldn't make any difference. And I think the reason they said that then was that actually they knew there was a shortage of masks. But you were well ahead of the game. Maybe you should have been in charge of procurement, Lenny. We wouldn't have had a problem.
Well, and what a stupid thing that one shipment came from China, and because China was short of PPE, we gave a load back to them, and that's what caused the shortage.
Well, of course, everybody was struggling for PPE. Countries all over the world were in search of it, and the vast majority of it, I think, was being made in China. And again, what this has taught us, Lenny, is that we need to be self-reliant on things that are critical to our existence, whether it's energy, whether it's PPE, whether it's the ability to produce vaccines in large quantities here in the UK, even things like paracetamol. We nearly ran out of that because it turned out, I think most of that was being made in India. And therefore, these things that are part of our critical sort of lifelines, actually, we've got to be so much more self-reliant on, haven't we?
Well, to put it bluntly, and this is what I used to say on another radio station that I used to participate on a lot, but I don't do it much now.
Good man.
And that is, when I talked about Hancock, I used to call him Hancock's half hour. I said, because what he says doesn't make sense, and he's a comedian.
Well, I suspect many might agree with you on that, Lenny. Just before I let you go, so Lenny, should Boris stay or should he go?
No, he's got to go.
And when do you want him to go, Lenny?
Well, I believe that the problem I got, I've been a Conservative all my life, but I haven't voted for them for many years. I am politically homeless. And the thing I've got, and he needs to go, but what it is, and the simple reason, I have lots of sayings in life, and if one lie, if you can justify one lie, then 100 is not too many.
Well, there you are. Lenny, thank you so much for your thoughts. That's Lenny, who thinks that Boris should go, and he can't understand why actually the government was so slow ordering PPE. He was ordering his mask in January 2020 before most people had realised of the crisis coming down the track. Keep those tweets and calls coming. We've got one here from North who says, credit to me. North criticised me yesterday for my relentless Boris bashing. However, I'm the only presenter who's going to raise the issue of the Chinese spy and Barry Garden. I think actually others have talked about it, but I am deeply concerned about it. Paul, he says, Richard, I've lived in the US for 5 years. We weren't allowed to make political donations being a UK citizen. So how do we allow donations by people who aren't proven UK citizens? That was from Paul in Aberdeen. I suspect the answer is that Christine Lee is a British citizen. That's normally how it works. Anyway, keep those calls coming up. 0344 499. Stay with us. After the break, we've got Lord Ridley talking about Wuhan and Chinese, what I call Chinese Labgate. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Online and on your smart TV.
Talk Radio TV News.
Here are your headlines. I'm Nadira Tudor. Deporting Djokovic. The tennis star loses his fight with the Australian government to stay in the country. And the Labour leader slams Boris Johnson over alleged Downing Street parties. As it's revealed, the PM could be planning a mass clear-out of his team. Novak Djokovic says he's extremely disappointed after losing a High Court bid to stay in Australia and the chance to defend his Open title. The tennis star had his visa revoked for a second time on Friday after the government there argued that his stance on avoiding COVID vaccines could bolster anti-vax sentiment in the country. Lawyers for the men's world number one had said a coronavirus infection last month meant he could legally enter. The 34-year-old now faces a 3-year ban on returning, but the Prime Minister says the decision will keep Australians safe. The Labour leader says the Prime Minister broke the law when he allegedly attended Downing Street parties during lockdown. Sir Keir Starmer has also accused Boris Johnson of lying in the House of Commons during the scandal. It comes as The Times reports that Boris Johnson is set to have a mass clear-out of his staff and ban alcohol consumption in Number 10. In a shake-up designed to save his premiership.
But I think it's pretty obvious what's happened. There's industrial-scale partying that's been going on at Downing Street. Not much of it is really denied, and I think that the public have made up their mind. I think the facts speak for themselves. I think the Prime Minister broke the law. I think he then lied about what had happened.
And former DJ Benjamin Alexander will become the first skier ever to represent Jamaica at the Winter Olympics. The 34-year-old says he was inspired to do so by the film Cool Runnings and that his story mirrors the movie after first taking up the sport in 2016. That's your news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio.
A first magnitude star of common sense.
The Tice Man.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
Richard Tice.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. It is just about 11:33, and just to put some numbers on some of these donations from some of these Chinese companies to our universities, just the context of this is extraordinary. Huawei gave over £25 million to Cambridge, it seems. Incredible sums of money. And it seems that Oxford University received well over £500,000, potentially up to over £2 million from Huawei since 2016. And also Oxford has received between £2 and £4 million from the China Scholarship Council, an arm of the Chinese Ministry of Education. Make of that what you will. But you see where I'm going with this stuff. And I think we've just got to have real eyes open and a real understanding of what is going on. But someone who really does understand what is going on is my next guest. I'm delighted he's with us because he's just co-authored a book called Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. Lord Ridley, a peer who's been well aware of the issues surrounding what's been going on with COVID, the potential origins of COVID, and also concerns about people influencing what we were or weren't allowed to think and believe regarding those origins. Matt Ridley, very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. So,
good morning, Richard. Nice to be with you.
Nice to be with you too. Thank you. And so you've co-authored this book, and I know you've talked on Talk Radio about it. But then there's also this article that's emerged about, in a sense, the pressure to change the debate and to label anybody who thought that COVID didn't come from bats and the wet markets, that we must be some form of conspiracy theorist. And it turns out that actually some very important discussions and emails took place and were sent between really senior people, not just in America like Fauci and Francis Collins, but here in the UK involving the director, no less, the sort of the chief executive of the Wellcome Foundation, Sir Jeremy Farrar.
That's right. This all concerns the first weekend of February 2020, shortly after which 3 articles appeared in the scientific press, all of which rubbished any idea that it could come from a laboratory. They said it was a conspiracy theory, it was crackpot, it was up there with the idea that it was caused by the 5G network and that kind of madness. And frankly, a lot of us believed it. I did. I thought, well, okay, these are serious virologists. They know what they're talking about. I talked to a couple of them. They said we can rule it out as a possibility. I was writing articles for the Wall Street Journal at the time. And then it gradually became apparent that that was not the case, that actually there was no evidence for the wet market. We still have not a single animal found to be carrying this virus before human beings got it. In 80,000 animals that were tested all across China. In the case of SARS, we were finding animals within a few months of the outbreak. We were finding a link with food handlers and things like that. So the evidence for the wet market theory simply isn't there. Meanwhile, the possibility that scientists themselves, senior scientists in the West, had, when they first got a look at the genome of this virus, said to themselves, hang on, this looks engineered. They didn't just say it looked like it had leaked from a lab. They said it looked like it had been manipulated in a lab, which is an even stronger theory than I was prepared to entertain for most of 2020 and 2021. And yet they quickly turned around after a meeting in early February and decided to knock that theory on the head to try and get it shut down. And that's a pretty odd thing to have done. And frankly, we need more transparency from them. We need the scientific establishment to come forward and say, look, here's why we changed our mind.
And the thing is, though, that when they first started to call for freedom of information to see these emails, they all appeared redacted, almost in their entirety. But fortunately, the contents have now been revealed. And it seems that Sir Jeremy Farrar, he initially actually was, it appears, concerned himself that it may not have been naturally created, but then was persuaded, almost as though it was in the best interests of science and relationships with China and scientific contacts with China, that we shouldn't discuss it. And he seems to have then been persuaded otherwise.
Well, that's what's really worrying about the content of the emails, which was revealed by staffers on the Republicans' Oversight Committee in Congress last week, is that they show that the motive for switching, going through a 180-degree switch from worrying about it being a manipulated virus to thinking that it, to rubbishing that theory, the motive for that switch appears to have been political rather than scientific. That is to say, let's try and nip this in the bud because it might damage the reputation of science in general and science in China in particular. Now, there are those of us, myself included, who are huge fans of science. I mean, I spent my entire career writing about championing, defending science. I think it's the greatest achievement of humankind, bar none, and think it, on the whole, does much more good than harm. But it's precisely for that reason that if something goes wrong in science, the scientists should be the first to say, hang on a minute, this wasn't right, we shouldn't have been doing it, because otherwise their enemies will do that for them. And I'm afraid there's a real crunch coming for science because of their failure to recognize the risks they were running in the research that was being done, particularly in Wuhan. I mean, remember, before 2019, if you wanted to find research going on SARS-like coronaviruses anywhere in the world, the number one location on the planet by a mile for that research was Wuhan.
Extraordinary. Can that really be a coincidence? But that's the point, isn't it, Matt, is that science is never settled and we only make progress by constantly challenging existing technology, existing science, existing thought processes, and other really bright, smart people coming in and saying, actually, we can do it better and better. But then someone else comes in from the side and challenges that. That's how you make progress. And if you try and shut down debate and say, oh, well, that's not good for our relationships, or with our links to that laboratory, or that's not good for science, then all of a sudden you stop progress, you stop honesty and transparency.
Well, that's right. That's what keeps science honest, is the fact that it's relatively fragmented. Professor A in University A says, I've got this pet theory, I think it's brilliant, I'm a genius. And Professor B says, you're talking nonsense. They have a right dust up, they get very cross with each other, they write a lot of papers, and then, the dust settles and we decide that he was half right and Professor B was half right. And, that's the way science has kept itself honest over the centuries, not by Professor A and Professor B getting together behind the scenes and agreeing on one common position that couldn't be challenged. That's the way the Catholic Church operates. That's not the way the scientific establishment should operate.
And that, of course, and then labelling anybody that might have the temerity to think that something may not be right, a conspiracy theorist, or some form of denier. Can I just push you a bit also on, because the US, they had their own inquiry, didn't they, with their various security services into the possibility of the lab leak. And last, I think it was August or September, that came out as being inconclusive, was I think amongst the expressions they used, which surprised me, actually. I must say, I thought they would arrive at a different conclusion. What do you think's behind that? There was a suggestion that was, in a sense, not to embarrass the president of the US in the run-up to the COP26 talks, when, of course, everybody wanted China to make some legally binding commitments for 2050.
Well, I can't tell you whether that motivation is part of it or not, but it has a ring of truth about it. What happened was that Joe Biden asked, I think it's something like 10 or 12 different intelligence agencies, each to make up their own mind independently in 90 days about whether they thought this was a lab leak or a natural occurrence. Most of them sat on the fence and said they couldn't tell. 3 of them said they had low confidence that it wasn't a lab leak. And one of them said it had moderate confidence that it was a lab leak. Now, we gather that was the FBI. And they, on the whole, are a pretty good organization that knows how to investigate things. And we also know that senior officials in the intelligence community who worked under Donald Trump, including David Asher, for example, have come forward and said, we know that at least 3 employees of the Wuhan Institute of Virology fell sick with symptoms very like COVID-19, sick enough to go to hospital in November 2019. And we think the wife of one of them died at that time. Now, that would be very interesting. I can't check that. I've found no way to verify that information. And you can't, I don't like to go on hearsay here, but that's the kind of information that we need further investigation of. So when they did that quick and dirty 90-day inquiry in the US intelligence community, they should have followed that up with saying, right, let's keep looking now. And now COP26 is out the way. Maybe we can be a little more forthright in what we're looking at.
Interesting. And just before I let you go, what are your thoughts on to the revelations about Spygate and Christine Lee and Barry Gardner? I mean, it feels to me like just the tip of the iceberg. I've called earlier in my show today, actually, there should be a full inquiry into funding from the Chinese regime into all parts of the British establishment, because I think that it is the tentacles spread far and wide. And I think that the establishment has been a combination of incredibly naive and incredibly greedy in taking the Chinese renminbi.
I agree with you. I think that the sums of money involved are enough to turn people's heads. £400,000 is a lot of money to an MP. It could enable him to realise quite a lot of his ambitions. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. As you say, there's a lot of soft power influence going on here. Seminars and conferences at which you get wined and dined, and somebody says to you late at night when you're feeling very benevolent, look, we in China feel really upset that we've had criticism from so-and-so. Could it's really unfair. Our people are doing the best. I had this right at the start of the pandemic, not directly from any Chinese contacts, but people saying to me, I think some of this stuff about how the Chinese might have leaked it is rather racist, don't you? And I would say, no, I don't think it's racist. Probably wrong, but I don't feel it's racist. This could happen in any lab. That's not the point. But I wonder where that was coming from. Do you know where I mean? I wonder how much of it was seeded into the conversation in perfectly legal ways by influencers on behalf of the Chinese establishment.
I think it's really significant, and we need to know what's going on. And it feels to me that they've actually been, in a sense, cozying up to all three main political parties, MPs, and in the House of Lords, universities and the like. Lord Ridley, thank you so much for your thoughts this morning. Really do appreciate it. That was Lord Ridley on his concerns about the origins of the virus, whether it came from the laboratory. He's written a book on it, and he's followed it incredibly closely. And I think we really do need much more transparency. And it is worrying when top scientists and directors, chief executives of charities, that they try essentially and cover up debate or prevent debate and trying to shut it down. That is not the way to get the right information. We need more transparent, open, honest debate. Give us a call, 0344 499 1000. Send in your tweets, your texts. Don't hold back. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV. The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
Shoot your shot.
Danger. Slippery people.
Uncomplicated life rubric for hungry thought thinkers.
Rock the House of Commons.
It's Talk Radio.
The home of common sense.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. That was Lord Ridley with his thoughts on the whether or not the virus came from the lab or otherwise, and whether or not people have been deliberately covering up discussion about it. The show is turning into a pronunciation fest and also an English literature fest. Gemma says, Richard, I've used the word temerity at least 4 times. I'm worried I'm going to wear it out. There we are, Gemma. Thanks for that. And we're going to try again. Graham, are you listening? Xinjiang is what I'm told. I've even had people leaving messages on my mobile phone. This is extraordinary. Meanwhile, we've got, who have we got here whose a text message has come in saying Putin says the gas shortage is because of US providers selling to Asia instead of the EU at higher prices. Can you fact check this? Whose propaganda do we believe? I have to say, one thing is for sure, I'm never going to believe Putin's propaganda. That is crystal clear. We've got another tweet that's come in from Stephen, who says, clearly Boris positioning to hang on as he embarks on a clear-out. Therefore, be a bit like the captain of the Titanic being the first into the lifeboats. Interesting thought there from Stephen. Meanwhile, in North Yorkshire, we've got Alistair on the phones. Good morning, Alistair. How are you? What are your thoughts?
Well, I was just enjoying the show, thank you. I was listening with interest to the guests who fell from Hartlepool talking about Boris and the fact that the public couldn't care an iota about the behaviour with the partying going on. I fundamentally disagree, Richard. I am appalled about what's been going on. Like thousands of other people, I couldn't attend a family funeral during the lockdown, and I'm now learning that parties were going on at Downing Street whilst the funeral was taking place. I am absolutely shocked.
And presumably, Alistair, you're furious about it.
Absolutely, very angry. Listening to the chairman of the Conservative Party today on TV talking about the fact that the culture starts at the top. You're damn right, the culture starts at the top. And the culture starts at the top with Boris Johnson. I think he's got to go.
Well, that's the right. It does. The leadership does start at the top, and that culture almost looks like a sort of wine time Friday. That culture during a pandemic where you're setting the rules, you're making the rules. Surely you've got to lead by example.
Correct. I mean, the country has done a fantastic job. Everyone has sacrificed an awful lot to learn that partying has been going on between at number 10 with his staff, with his civil servants. I think that is shocking, and he's got to go.
Because
time for a reset, get somebody else in. We've got a lot of work to do. Carry on.
And there's no question we have got a lot of work to do. That is for sure. But it was the insensitivity and the fact they clearly weren't afraid themselves, and therefore, in a sense, they didn't believe the rules that they had established, the draconian, authoritarian rules that everybody else had to abide by, including not being able to say goodbye to your loved ones whilst they might be in hospital, sadly dying, or at funerals.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
I think it's sending people absolutely mad. Alistair, just before I let you go, so do you and your friends, do you know what's meant by net zero, and what are people sort of saying about it, feeling about it?
I've got an idea of what it's about. I did agree with the guest from Hartlepool. I mean, 40, 50, 60, 70,000 pounds for an electric car. That is not within the reach of the ordinary man or woman on the street. So it's a lower down priority. I think the key priority, as it says, Northern Ireland, get that right, get Brexit right, get the economy moving again. Those are the key issues, not the green issue.
And what about energy bills? How much are people talking about that amongst you and your friends, Alistair?
Of course. My friends are starting to talk about that. I have a friend in Leeds who's talking about energy bills going up by £1,000 a year. That is a lot of money in anyone's language.
It's real money. It's serious money. Alistair, thank you so much for that. I really do appreciate that. It's great to get people's views. What's going on? Give us a call, 0344 499 1000. What are you and your friends talking about? What are the big issues that are winding you up? Dave in Southend, good morning. What's winding you up, Dave, this morning?
Hello, Mr. Tice. Winding me up. I tell you what, Mr. Tice, I'm like a clockwork dial at the moment. I mean, you just couldn't believe what's going on here. I believe that we owe, firstly, Talk Radio a great respect for what you're doing. I think we owe a big respect to the 101 Tories that have fought back. We would have been locked down no matter what at Christmas if it wasn't for them. And everyone, make sure you vote for them in the next general election, regardless of your colour, whether you're red or blue. Those men and women saved us. We are at a precipice here, Mr. Tice, on the brink of dictatorship. And we have got to be very careful here.
So what would you like Boris to do? Would you like him to go, or would you like him to stay and sort things out?
Boris has got to go. The cabinet has got to go. We don't want any of that lot brought back in as head, because you're just going to get the same old. If you're going to tell me that Starmer, Ed Day, problem in this country. A big problem. Please put a candidate in Southend, because I want to get rid of Dudridge, because he is the worst of Tory MPs. And I'd just like to say this, Mr. Tice, I'm sick to the back teeth, and I'll explain to you why quickly, of listening about poor Her Majesty, who's sitting there all alone. I had the same problem. I had 2 funerals, and we only had one person could go to those funerals. And I, at this moment in time, have got a brother-in-law on the brink of death, and has been stopped. His wife has been stopped from visiting him because he needs it. And this is because of Johnson, Javid. People, they're going to release the restrictions, but it's because they want to get us back on track, because they know we're against them. But my brother-in-law is on the brink of death, and he's been stopped from having a visit from his wife.
It's unbelievable that these restrictions are still going on. It really is, when there's just no logic or science that I can understand whatsoever. Dave, I'm so sorry for your family and friends in that situation. Before I let you go, Dave, just give me some thoughts on net zero. I'm really keen to understand what people are saying and talking about it, you and your friends. Do you know what it means? Do you know when it might impact? Are you concerned about it?
I couldn't give a damn about net zero. All my life, I'm old enough to know about, we had the ozone layer, hole in the ozone. Being afraid. Everyone is afraid. I do not know what they're afraid of. I don't know why people are afraid of their employers. Stand up for yourselves, guys. We need to push forward. And Mr. Tice, you need to get into Parliament. And the only way is for us to get you in there. But I'll tell you this, Tories, listen, if you don't get rid of Johnson, then we will get rid of him in the election, and we will take a lot of your scalps with him.
There we are.
If you don't get rid of him.
Dave, that is clear. It's fair to say that you have been wound up like a clock, and you have unleashed this morning on Talk Radio. That was Dave in Southend. Thank you very much with his thoughts. With absolute clarity. We've got tweets and messages coming in. One here from Catherine in Cardiff. What a magnificent speaker Lord Ridley is. Could you please repeat the title of the book he co-authored? Yes, I can. It was called, let me find it. It was called Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. I hope that helps, Catherine. And there's another one here from Jem, which says, let me get this right. My dad discharged himself for hospital. So far, the catheter has needed 10 times. Can't get hold of anyone at social services. I hope you get that sorted. Gemma, stay with us. Coming up, we're going to be talking to Henry Bolton, OBE, and much more to discuss. Keep the calls coming in. It's Tice Talk.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV. The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Live at 12, I'm Nadira Tudor. Deporting Djokovic, the tennis star loses his fight with Australian government to stay in the country. The Labour leader slams Boris Johnson over alleged Downing Street parties as it's revealed the PM could be planning a mass clear-out of his team. And how the film Cool Runnings inspired this man to become Jamaica's first ever Olympic skier. Novak Djokovic says he's extremely disappointed after losing a High Court bid to stay in Australia and the chance to defend his Open title. The tennis star had his visa revoked for a second time on Friday after the government there argued that his stance on avoiding COVID vaccines could bolster anti-vax sentiment in the country. Lawyers for the men's world number one had said a coronavirus infection last month meant he could legally enter. The 34-year-old now faces a 3-year ban on returning, but the Prime Minister says the decision will keep Australians safe. The Labour leader says the Prime Minister broke the law when he allegedly attended Downing Street parties during lockdown. Sir Keir Starmer has also accused Boris Johnson of lying in the House of Commons during the scandal. It comes as The Times reports that Boris Johnson is set to have a mass clear-out of his staff and ban alcohol consumption in Number 10 in a shake-up designed to save his premiership.
But I think it's pretty obvious what's happened. There's industrial-scale partying that's been going on at Downing Street. Not much of it is really denied, and I think that the public have made up their mind. I think the facts speak for themselves. I think the Prime Minister broke the law. I think he then lied about what had happened.
A man who was shot dead after taking hostages in a synagogue in Texas could have been British, according to reports. The suspect, who's yet to be named, entered the congregation Beth Israel Synagogue in the US state of Texas on Saturday, holding 4 people hostage for over 12 hours. The standoff ended at around 9 p.m. when an FBI SWAT team entered the building. The Foreign Office said it's monitoring the situation and are in contact with local authorities. Prince Harry seeking a judicial review against the Home Office over their decision not to allow him to pay for private security in the UK. The royal's legal representatives claim he wants to bring his son Archie and 7-month-old baby daughter Lilibet to visit from the US, but fears it's too dangerous. He wants to fund the security himself rather than ask taxpayers to foot the bill. And former DJ Benjamin Alexander will become the first skier ever to represent Jamaica at the Winter Olympics. The 34-year-old says he was inspired to do so by the film Cool Runnings and that his story mirrors the movie after first taking up the sport in 2016. That's your live news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Mid-morning talk.
Sunday talk.
Talk Radio. Take a chance with the Tice Man.
Talk Radio. Richard Tice.
Sunday morning devotion, there isn't a sermon.
Talk Radio's Common Sense Weekend.
Richard Tice.
On Talk Radio.
Welcome back. It is now the afternoon. We're into the third and final hour of my show, Tice Talk. The weather is actually lifting a tiny bit. I can now see parts of the City of London here from Talk Radio Towers. Tweets coming in, keep them coming. Agreeing with Dave there from Southend about his concerns. Don't hold back. 0344 499 1000. And lots of concerns about the influence of China. I'll come to tweets and calls a bit later this hour because now we need to talk about the Home Office, and new rules have been coming in apparently to crack down on this significant issue of some of the channel crossing illegal migrants who are claiming to be children, even though actually they're in their 20s. And the numbers involved are quite extraordinary. For example, in the year to September 2021, of the 1,696 cases where the age was called into question, it turns out that 2/3, over 1,100, were found to be 18 or older. Well, I'm delighted now to be joined by Henry Bolton, OBE Chairman of BRICBAC and an expert on international border matters to discuss this. Henry, good afternoon to you. So,
afternoon, Richard. Hi.
Is this something unusual and something extraordinary? Are the Home Office getting their act together and doing something right for a change?
Very, very slowly, Richard. In mainland Europe, the authorities there have been implementing various scientific methods to assess somebody's age if there's any doubt about it, if they're claiming to be children and they don't appear to be. And they've been doing that for years. The Home Office is way, way behind the loop. And there are very well-proven scientific methods for doing this. They're fairly straightforward. And the other thing that the Home Office is doing now, really because there is so much criticism of the Home Office from the left and from the pro-asylum seeker camp, that they're not simply implementing these tried and tested methods. They're actually they're forming a body, a committee that is going to assess all the different types of scientific method and then make recommendations. It's going to be a little while before any of this is implemented. And in the meantime, it's not just the numbers, Richard, that are frightening, but it's the numbers combined with the fact that if we don't know their age, we clearly don't know who these people are. They're going into schools where we've got children. They're adults, adult males, going in and sitting in classrooms with children in the UK. That's obviously a concern in itself, but it's indicative of the fact that we've got no idea what the identity of these people is. And if they're lying about their age, what else are they lying about in terms of their origin, their affiliations, their motives for coming here, and so on? It's, the Home Office is way behind the loop.
Essentially, they're told to lie about their age by the vile people smugglers, aren't they? Because then they get, is it right, they then get additional benefits and they're more likely to be allowed permission to stay?
Well, it's particularly the latter, that they're more likely to be allowed to stay. And also, it's an opportunity for them to interact with the community, worryingly children, in a way that they then can potentially later claim helps them to sort of settle in the UK in terms of appeals and so on. Now, I mean, if somebody's lying about their age to gain some sort of additional advantage, then for me, that's grounds to really reject their asylum claim. And indeed, on that basis, again, the French, the Germans and so on, who are often criticised for their approach to asylum seekers and migration and encouraging it too much, actually, they're encouraging it a great deal less than we are. They will turn these asylum claims down in many cases simply because, rather like Djokovic and his tennis, false claims on your or false statements on your application. Well, there should be the same penalty for asylum seekers here in the UK. If you're telling a lie in order to come into this country and gain advantage here, you should be out on your ear.
Absolutely. I mean, that should be, in a sense, rule number one. And you're saying that we're not using technology that other countries are using in order to help clarify someone's age?
Correct. I mean, so for example, you can gauge somebody's age, I think most people know this pretty much, through x-rays of the teeth. You can sort of see how the teeth have evolved. There's similar techniques with doing x-rays of the collarbone and the development and fusion of bones in the wrist. It's a simple x-ray process. Two experts have a look at it, and medical experts, and they can make a very accurate assessment as to somebody's age. We're not doing it. Well, we haven't been doing it. They do it elsewhere.
Is there any sign? Is there any sign that we might start to be doing it?
I think there's no question, Richard. I mean, are the Home Office doing the right thing? They are doing the right thing, absolutely, by bringing this in. But it's too slow. These people are going to be coming over again in large numbers in the spring. There is no doubt about that in my mind. At least as large numbers as last year. We're going to have the same problem. And will this committee that the Home Office has asked to look at the different scientific methods that they could employ, is that committee going to be reporting and its findings implemented in time for that? In the meantime, why is it that Priti Patel doesn't simply take what, for example, the French or the Germans or the Norwegians or the Danes are doing and just implement it as an interim measure until the committee has ruled on or recommended any change to that?
Extraordinary. And in terms of the numbers, obviously it's January and the weather's pretty rough, but there have already been a significant number of boats coming across the channel, haven't there? In terms of the latest update of numbers, how does this compare to this time last year, and what indication does that give us about the direction of travel for the months ahead?
The direction of travel, Richard, is worrying, in a word. Last year, there were not so many coming over in the winter. They weren't coming over so much in daylight as they are now, and they weren't coming over in the weather conditions that they are now. They are coming over in worse weather conditions. There are a number of reasons for that. There's slightly larger boats that they're using in some cases, and slightly less laden, fewer number of migrants on board. So they're learning from their mistakes. But they're coming now in numbers that they weren't last year or the year before, and that is an indication that those numbers are going to also be higher than they were last year come the spring and the better weather. And indeed, I have to say that the weather out in the Channel for the last few days hasn't been that bad, and there are clear spells ahead. None of these measures, Richard, the Home Office has been looking at implementing have yet been implemented. I think they've been sitting thinking, right, we've got a period of grace over the winter and the early spring when the weather's not so good. Well, I'm sorry, they're still coming in their hundreds and nothing's been done about it.
And they're all clinging to this idea that the Nationality and Borders Bill will make all the difference. But it's months and months before that gets passed into law. And I don't think you and many others think that's going to make any difference at all.
I've said I give them 6 or 7 out of 10 for the legislation. But the problem is, Richard, that first of all, in government, you need to decide what your objectives are. You develop a policy to do that. Then you look at or a strategy, you look at the legislation and see, does the legislation allow us to do that? Does it give us the necessary powers or does it obstruct us? If the answer is yes, then you adjust the legislation. You don't start with the legislation because then you find that there are numerous gaps. And maybe it's a conversation for another time, but I've already identified many gaps in the legislation. There are actually 3 pieces of legislation going through at the moment, including the bill that you've just mentioned. But there are gaps in that. There are things that the Home Office is going to have to go back and revisit in terms of legislation because the present bills going through Parliament simply don't provide them with the powers and the facilitation that they need because they put the cart before the horse. It's another example of lack of strategic planning and acumen on the part of not just the Home Office, but the government.
We're talking about a lack of planning. I'd also just get your view, please, on a lack of common sense. I don't know if you saw the story about the judge that rejected the bid by the Home Office to deport an Afghan rapist who was convicted and jailed. And the reason was because the Taliban take a dim view of sex attacks and therefore he may not be safe. I mean, what is going on? This is just madness, isn't it?
Yeah, well, one of the things that the Home Office is addressing in the legislation is the definition of persecution. At the moment, there is a lower evidence or lower quality of evidence required or proof required for a claim that an individual will face persecution if they return to somewhere than there is, for example, the sort of standard of proof that you require in a civil or criminal court. Far lower. It's basically a very, if there is any possibility whatsoever that somebody might face any sort of persecution when they go back, the law says that we can't send them back. It's ridiculous. There is no measure given to that. So the judge in this case is actually technically right.
Let me just read you.
The government has failed with its legislation. Sorry.
Let me just read you, Henry, their judgment, because I just can't believe this. I sort of hope it's not true, but I fear it is. The judgment, the 2 judges accepted the defendant's claim that whilst he represents a danger to the community of the United Kingdom, there remains a very strong public interest in deportation, but recent events in Afghanistan meant sending him back would breach his human rights.
Under UK law, I'm afraid at the moment, Richard, they would. The judge has to make a technical decision. Now, but my point here is this is a very clear example of how the government has drafted its legislation in the wrong manner. We should be looking at safeguarding the British public first and draft legislation accordingly, not start looking at whether or not we're safeguarding the human rights of an individual who is a danger to everybody.
That's the role of a British government, is to look after British citizens and keep us all safe.
Correct.
Henry, thank you so much for your thoughts and views. That's Henry Bolton, OBE, Chairman of BritBack and International Border Control expert, with his thoughts on that. Keep the tweets and the messages and the calls coming in. We're going to be taking those in a second. A message here from Catherine DeBell, who says, why do I not mention the Talk Radio, the documentary that was on the website a while back called What Really Happened at Wuhan? I did watch that. It was excellent. If you haven't watched it, do watch it. I don't know if it's still on the website or it'll be available elsewhere, no doubt, on YouTube. Stay with us. We'll take your calls next. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV. The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake. Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk radio.
Get a grip.
Raw talk. Pure energy.
More taste, more flavour, more outspoken than ever.
Clear-headed. Honest opinion.
Lively debate.
Talk radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here at Talk Radio. The weather is lifting a little bit, and we've got a message here that's come in on Twitter from Gareth of Preston, who says, I like this, he's just told on the news that Tony Blair doesn't want Boris removing from office. In that case, he should definitely go if you do the opposite of what Blair wants in all circumstances. I enjoy that. Lots of people agreeing with what Dave from Southend said. There was a reason that there was a couple of bleeps, which I think Dave in his enthusiasm was a little bit fruity with his language. And it is, of course, a family show. So callers, please do keep it clean so that we can listen to everything that is said. Kieran from Tring, he says, the Tories who voted for Boris knew he's a wild man, but they believed he was conservative. But it turns out he's so far to the left in every way that the Tories would rather have Sir Keir in number 10. At least we know what we're getting. The parties don't matter. It's the policies that are useless. That's Kieran. Interesting thoughts. And then Anne-Marie says, first time she's listened to the show. Welcome, Anne-Marie. I hope you'll stay. She's enjoyed it. Great topics. Happy to hear that we're talking about, not scared of bringing the issues that matter about China's human rights and the COVID pandemic. Anne-Marie, thanks for joining in. Stay with us. And we're going up to Glasgow. Abdul, a very good afternoon to you. How are you doing? So tell me, what are your thoughts?
Hi, good afternoon. Yeah, great show, by the way. My thoughts are, I've been watching the news, listening to the radio, and, obviously being in Glasgow, born, bred, I was previously a Labour voter, but obviously when the carpet bombed in the Middle East, I vowed never to put my cross on that ballot paper ever again. So that said, I started voting SNP, which I think they're doing a fantastic job. But I've never ever voted Conservative in my life. I probably wouldn't consider it even because of my working class background and whatnot. I will say that, and I've said this to all my friends, that the Conservative Party have done an absolute sterling job through the pandemic financially in terms of giving people the furlough, helping as much as they can for people that are self-employed and whatnot. Now,
that's interesting because actually many self-employed actually didn't get any help, but some did. And many have said that actually it was the self-employed who were abandoned by what was otherwise a pretty successful furlough scheme.
Yeah. But then again, how many each individual people, and 50 million people that are actually probably working, can you actually service? But okay, that's fine. But going forward, what's happened here is as if Boris Johnson was working for a private company. Would he be employed right now?
Well, that's a very good question. Tell me, Abdul, in terms of voting for the SNP, were you voting for them because of their competence in running Scotland under devolution, or because of their views on independence, or a bit of both?
I'll tell you twice. Once when I went into the ballot box, I was still not sure. And you know what it was? It was as I went into the ballot box and I voted for independence. And the reason for that was that I have a lot of respect for Nicola Sturgeon and the job that she's done in Scotland. The roads, the hospitals, the schools are getting built everywhere. Housing's getting built everywhere. You actually can't fault her.
Really?
Really?
Goodness me! I mean, this is breaking news, folks. Somebody thinks you can't fault Nicola Sturgeon. Abdul, this is extraordinary. What?
Well, listen, you've got to be grateful. You look around you. We've got policing, we've got nurses, we can go to the hospital. My background's obviously from Pakistan. And I get a wake-up call when I go to my village in Pakistan when you can't even turn a tap.
Oh, for sure. But I'm comparing it to public services elsewhere in the United Kingdom. For example, I think that the SNP's record on education and indeed the NHS is amongst the worst in the UK. And I think Glasgow is tragically, it is the worst city in the whole of Europe in terms of drug deaths.
No, that's Dundee, actually. You've got your facts wrong there. But that said, if we can nitpick lots of things, but generally, Glasgow and the voting counts speaks for itself.
Okay, and Abdul, if you actually the independence vote had gone through and you expressed your appreciation for furlough and things, where do you think the money would have come from? From the Scottish coffers to pay for all that furlough?
It would be with a bit of obviously hindsight. Then it would have been a lot better now because we'd still be part of the European Union.
So you think they'd have given you some money instead of Westminster?
No, not trade. We would have traded with them.
The bottom line is, Abdul, you seem to want money from someone else, not from Scotland.
No, listen, you're the one that's talking about money. We don't want any money. Why are you talking about money? Scotland doesn't want your money.
Because money paid the furlough, didn't it, Abdul?
Sorry?
Well, the furlough scheme worked because it was cash provided by central government into people's pockets.
Yes. Yeah, but Scotland is part of the union.
It is,
so and not think that Scotland also put into
that. No, I love that union. I'm a massive proponent of the union, and part of the strength was our ability to help all the regions of the union at this time of crisis. And I'm fascinated that you think that Nicola's doing a great job. And that's fantastic. Abdul, thank you so much. Keep listening, keep calling with that input. We'll check that Dundee stat. That wasn't my recollection, but hey, we'll double check it. We're then going to go over to Crewe, I think, from Glasgow, where we've got Charlie. Charlie, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
I'm tremendous. What would you like to say?
Well, that last call staggers me because this is the trouble. You vilify Boris Johnson too much and we end up with somebody like Sturgeon or Drakeford. Or even worse, the Prime Minister of Australia, who really now, with their system, has set such a precedent. That's what more worries me. So would you happily keep Boris? I mean, I'm a big Conservative supporter, and Sir Graham Brady, I know very well. We never agreed, Graham and myself, and we talked about this many times over the last few years, we never agreed with some of the measures. We thought they were a bit stupid, some were very draconian. We're not even sure that Boris agreed with them, but when the scientists are telling you that we've got a pandemic that's going to kill hundreds of thousands of people, I think Boris was put in such an awful position. I didn't know really what he could do. But I would say that I know this for a fact, that millions of people in this country have ignored the rules from the very beginning. They've been opening up pubs, they've been going in, shutting the doors, drinking behind closed doors, and it's happened all through the inner cities, Manchester, Liverpool, London, all over the place. So it's very hypocritical of a media-led campaign against Boris to try and bring him down.
So let's just. I hadn't heard that about pubs opening up and shutting, but then maybe I've just been speaking to the wrong people. But in a sense, in a sense, maybe that shows that what people were doing was concluding that the rules didn't make any common sense, and that they were making their own judgments themselves, which is what certain other regimes, whether it was Florida, whether it was Sweden, they said, look, these are the risks of COVID, but we trust you to make your own judgments, depending on whether or not you're, for example, whether you're vulnerable, whether you're elderly, or whether you're young and healthy. And in a sense, I think what really winds so many people up, Charlie, about what happened in these number 10 gatherings, and I get the fact that they were working hard and stressed and just wanted just a bit of a break, it's the fact that they were so willingly flouting the rules, the draconian rules that they set on other people. And I think the thing that most upsets people is that they couldn't even go to say goodbye to their loved ones in hospitals or to funerals, when clearly the people making the rules in number 10 weren't afraid of the virus.
Well, I've got first-hand experience of that, because in April 2021, my father passed away in hospital. And when we had the funeral in May, only 20 were allowed to go there. But I don't excuse that. But at the end of the day, people were breaking the rules because they didn't think they affected them, or they thought they were stupid rules. Now, I think Boris felt the same. But he was under that much pressure from, Labour were all for all the rules. Every party was for it. There was only a few dissenting voices. I think there was 10 at the very beginning who were against them, but everybody else was for him. So Boris just went along with it all. But I'm worried about getting rid of Boris, and there are worse people in the Conservative Party to take over, which we would end up like Australia, we'd end up like Wales and Scotland. And the previous caller, well, I don't know which planet he's coming on, because really...
Well, it's fair to say, Charlie, that one or two tweets have coming in about Abdul from Glasgow, also surprised at his thoughts. But hey, that's what democracy is about. And the SNP, they did win the elections back in May. We have just checked, Charles, whilst you're on. I don't think Abdul's right. Scotland continues to have the worst drug death rate, tragically, in the whole of Europe. 21 deaths per 1,000 of population July last year. And Glasgow was once again found to be the worst area for people struggling with addiction. Almost 300 people sadly dying there last year. But there we go. Just before you go, Charlie, net zero, tell us about the thoughts of your friends and yourself. Do you know what net means for you and your families and friends?
Net zero means a lot of costs. Net zero as far as boilers concerned, net zero about electric cars concerned, net zero is just going to, inflation. I speak to Graham Brady a lot, and I say to him, let's worry about 5% inflation. Let's worry about the cost of living. Let's worry about doubling fuel bills. Let's worry about poverty in the community. Let's not worry about Boris having a few drinks in Downing Street, although it does grate a little bit. It's not the most important thing that people think about. We've got to put food on the table. That's what we talk about in the Shires. We don't talk about Boris. We know he's a bit of a...
Yes. So you're talking about the bills, the energy bills. You know net zero is going to be expensive.
That's what matters to people. Look, we're putting pressure on Boris not to go down the net zero route, but he's under pressure from around the world.
But surely he's got to have the strength. He's the leader. He's got to make the decisions.
Yes, he's the leader, and we're putting pressure on him to change track on this.
Good man, Charlie. You keep putting the pressure on. We're all putting pressure on. Time's against us, but that was Charlie and crew with his thoughts. Stay with us. Coming up, we're going to be talking about PPE contracts, more cash going into the wrong hands. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV. News.
Here are your headlines. I'm Nadira Tudor. Deporting Djokovic. The tennis star loses his fight with the Australian government to stay in the country. And the Labour leader slams Boris Johnson over alleged Downing Street parties as it's revealed the PM could be planning a mass clear-out of his team. Novak Djokovic says he's extremely disappointed after losing a High Court bid to stay in Australia and the chance to defend his Open title. The tennis star had his visa revoked for a second time on Friday after the government there argued that his stance on avoiding COVID vaccines could bolster anti-vax sentiment in the country. Lawyers for the men's world number one had said a coronavirus infection last month meant he could legally enter. The 34-year-old now faces a 3-year ban on returning, but the Prime Minister says the decision will keep Australians safe. The Labour leader says the Prime Minister broke the law when he allegedly attended Downing Street parties during lockdown. Sir Keir Starmer has also accused Boris Johnson of lying in the House of Commons during the scandal. It comes as The Times reports that Boris Johnson is set to have a mass clear-out of his staff and ban alcohol consumption in Number 10. In a shake-up designed to save his premiership.
But I think it's pretty obvious what's happened. There's industrial-scale partying that's been going on at Downing Street. Not much of it is really denied, and I think that the public have made up their mind. I think the facts speak for themselves. I think the Prime Minister broke the law. I think he then lied about what had happened.
And former DJ Benjamin Alexander will become the first skier ever to represent Jamaica at the Winter Olympics. The 34-year-old says he was inspired to do so by the film Cool Runnings and that his story mirrors the movie after first taking up the sport in 2016. That's your news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake. Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio. Common sense radio for common sense people.
Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
Richard Tice.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here. We're into the last half hour of what's been a busy show. We did enjoy an extraordinary call from Glasgow, Abdul, which was fascinating. And we've got some tweets coming in here. Jane says, to me, net zero means once this is bought in, the people will have net zero of anything. That's an interesting thought. And then we've got one from Sue in Chelmsford. Net COVID is offsetting jet travel for the rich and control of the rest of us through our wallets. I think that people are very concerned about net zero, but I always want your thoughts, and I'm always going to keep asking about that. Keep those calls coming in. And just whilst I've got you before our next guest, you may recall over the last couple of weeks I had a discussion with Matt Letizia and then Professor Sharma about the concerns about cardiac issues, chest issues with footballers. I have written to the Chief Executive of the FA to ask what research they're doing, what timing that might take place, and what questions they're asking and research they're doing. I'm waiting to hear. So as and when I do hear it, I've invited them onto the show. Hopefully they will come onto the show. And I'm going to be coming back to the big issue of furlough. Because yes, as actually Abdul said, furlough was very successful in many quarters, which was brilliant. The truth is that it cost billions and billions of pounds. And there are many companies out there who took furlough when they were still making huge profits. And I think that was totally unacceptable. The good news is some companies gave money back, but others have hung on to it. Big publicly listed companies. And again, I've written to them. I'm going to be asking them to come on the show and explain themselves. And talking of cash and PPE, I'm hoping we've got our guest to discuss this, because there was a court ruling this week in the High Court brought by the Good Law Project and Every Doctor, which claimed that the Department of Health was unlawfully awarding contracts to favoured suppliers who are in what's called the VIP lane of essentially people who had access to MPs and ministers and senior officials, and that gave them an unfair advantage. And the judge ruled that it was unlawful to give the two companies preferential treatment as part of the VIP lane. But interestingly, she also said that the offers were likely to have been given contracts anyway. And I think that, in a sense, vindicates what the Department for Health was saying, which is that the contracts were the most competitive contracts. I can tell you from my own experience that I'm struggling with this, because the reality is some of these contracts were for hugely inflated sums. I know of individuals who, for the sake of a couple of phone calls, have made millions and millions of pounds, or by way of commission, literally by being the introducing agent. And that some of these companies, and more will come out, and all credit to the Good Law Project and others who've been pursuing this. It's one thing being in a VIP lane, but it's another thing altogether actually, in a sense, ripping the taxpayer off and making egregious sums of money, hugely inflated sums, at a time of a national emergency, at a time of a national crisis. I would have thought it would have been a case of all shoulders to the wheel, we'll help out. Yes, there should be, a modest profit percentage for guaranteeing that the items would arrive. But, I mean, the quantities of profit that have been made, and more will definitely come out, have been utterly, utterly egregious. And I'm hoping that we're going to be joined by someone from the campaign group We Own It, John Bosco, who's the lead campaigner there, to talk about this. John Bosco, a very good afternoon to you. Thanks for being with us here on Tice Talk to talk about this. I know you've been campaigning on a variety of issues at We Own It. So what's your feeling about this ruling? So on the one hand, the judge said it's unlawful, but on the other hand, it said even if they went down the normal route, they probably still would have got the contract.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, for having us, and good afternoon to your viewers and listeners. First of all, I just wanted to kind of express our pleasure at this ruling and our congratulations, of course, to the Good Law Project and Every Doctor who decided to take this to the courts and extracted this ruling. So that's that. On the issue of whether or not, essentially, on the question you asked, I think that the government had a serious they entered the crisis with a serious misapprehension of what the needs of the country were. You might not know, but in 2018, the government actually decided to privatize NHS supply chain. Essentially, the framework that was put in place much earlier to prepare the country for a pandemic. And they parceled out NHS supply chain to different companies like DHL and Deloitte and Movian too, to perform these duties. And what we found in a report released last year, what we found was that the country was utterly unprepared. And I think that the real reason why this was the case was that the government had a privatize and outsource first and ask questions later approach to pretty much every service. I think if we took this crisis as seriously as we needed to take it, we would have made a decision at the onset before 150,000 people died.
But John Bosco, if you take this issue of the PPE, and I mean, the point was, look, the bottom line was that there was a shortage of PPE and we needed more of it. And so I guess we all understood the need to place the orders quickly and promptly, but there were existing supply lines in place. And most of the PPE, as we know and I've talked about, comes from China, and everybody was scrabbling around trying to order it. My question is, why wasn't the existing supply chains used and able to supply it faster? Why was it that someone who might be involved in making something completely unrelated to PPE, all of a sudden able to make a few phone calls, bung on tens and tens and tens of millions of pounds additional profit onto the contract and get awarded it through the VIP lane?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a problem that we have been raising at We Own It for a very long time. The idea that if you take a privatization first approach, there is the risk of corruption. And what we've seen with the VIP lanes was that a company, for example, had a 1 in 10 chance of getting a contract if they were in the VIP lane, whereas if they were not in the VIP lane, they had a 1 in 100 chance of getting a contract. And so there is a clear
but what's your response to the suggestion from the judge that even if they'd been in the standard lane, they probably would have been awarded the contract anyway?
So the judge was speaking specifically about the company that the case was about. It wasn't speaking broadly about this issue. And you might remember, of course, that we found a Telegraph report found that over £2 billion worth of PPE were essentially wasted because they were not up to standard, because the companies that were contracted to deliver them could not deliver the required quality. And the government, of course, didn't want to risk our NHS staff and therefore decided not to use those products. And we also know that the government spent almost £10 billion in a contract with private hospitals during this pandemic. And during the height of the pandemic, these private companies or these private hospitals essentially had only 8 people.
Extraordinary. But in a sense, that's incompetence from the civil servants and for the managers in the NHS who didn't use their resources properly and wisely and smartly, it seems to me.
No, I think it's more an issue of corruption, essentially, as not just this ruling. There was
so are you suggesting that the civil servants were getting were being rewarded for placing these contracts?
Not at all. I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that the fact that there was a VIP lane where politicians, and we know, for example, the Grant Shapps and Matt Hancock and Esther McVeigh and even Dominic Cummings referred some of the companies that were put on the VIP lane, who some of which then got contracts. That does not resemble anything that a sensible government would do. So there was clearly an agenda that aimed directly at privatizing pretty much every aspect of our COVID response. And that privatization agenda then lent itself to a corrupt kind of approach to securing contracts. I think the government should have explored seriously the possibilities of kind of taking over into public ownership or even just public control of some of these companies so that it could produce these things itself within.
Well, I guess what we've learned from this is actually the smart thing as a nation is to have much more self-reliant on critical things to do with public health, whether it's medicines, whether it's PPE and the like. And I've been talking about that and will continue to talk about that. Just before we let you go, John Bosco, are there many more of these court cases being brought by the likes of Good Law Project and others?
There are a few cases that are, I believe, being brought by the Good Law Project that I'm not entirely familiar with. There is also a case that's been brought by other campaigners around the takeover of GP surgeries. It's currently in the courts, and we believe it's going to be coming in February. But before you let me go, I just wanted to contribute to the earlier discussion you had about whether or not there should be a ban on China owning critical infrastructure.
Oh yes, what's your thought on that?
Because I was listening to the entire show, and I was just thinking, why do we want to stop with China, really? The question really should be, should there be a ban on private ownership of the critical infrastructure?
John Bosco, that is a big topic. I'm going to come back to it, and I'm welcome to get you back on the show because that is a really good question, and I've got some strong... that was John Bosco Nobu, who has some strong views about the PPE contracts and also on other matters. We'll get him back on. Thank you very much for that. Coming up, we're taking your calls before the top of the hour before we head towards Bob Mills at 1 o'clock. Don't go anywhere. Give us a call. It's 0344 499 1000. It's Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV. The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake. Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk radio. Rev it up, roar it out.
The voice of the people.
The home of common sense.
Solid state human debate on a digital platform.
Radio that stands to reason.
Listen and learn.
Talk radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. I'm loving the messages and tweets coming in. Nasher says, the parties themselves may not matter. It's the contempt that Boris's elite have for ordinary people which led to the parties, which is also driving net stupid, dodgy contract and high taxes. That's Nasher's clear view. Whereas Brexit Duck, he listened to Anne Widdecombe earlier, said she's spot on. Boris needs to drop his net zero agenda. We contribute 1% of emissions whilst China is producing 3.8 billion tonnes of coal per annum. That's burning, I think, 3.8 billion tonnes of coal. And another one here from Carl, who says foreign countries should not be allowed ownership of our critical infrastructure. My worries about Boris going would be who takes over. There we are. Mario in London is on the line. Good afternoon, Mario. What would you like to say?
Good afternoon, Richard. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Chinese situation. I think there's two sides to this story. It's more than just like Chinese companies giving 5 or 10 million to Oxford. I think you need to look into the Blackstone Group, and the CEO of Blackstone, Stephen Schwarzman, he's donated 150 million pounds to Oxford University and 100 million to Tsinghua University in China, and they're working together to give scholarships to Chinese students through what's called the Rhodes Trust Scholarship, which of course was what President Clinton got in the 60s. He came to Oxford. So Oxford has been doing that since 2015, bringing in communist Chinese students to study in this country.
And I think the point is, and in a sense, anybody's entitled to donate, but what you need is complete transparency. But as a nation, we need to be careful about what are the motivations of an autocratic communist regime when donations are coming from state-sponsored or state-owned entities.
That's right. But Steven Schwartzman, who's an American private equity CEO, he's working with the Chinese Communist Party in China to fund hundreds of millions of dollars in.
Yes, and I guess as a private.
I think it goes both ways. And
well,
why
it could do.
Oxford University want to bring in
communist
Chinese.
What we do know, Mary, is that these universities, they're always looking for money and scholarships. That is for sure. Just before I let you go, Mary, because I've just got another call as well. What's the view of your friends and yourself about net zero? Are you talking about it? Are you aware of the cost? Do you know what it means?
Well, I worked in the City of London, and I could see back in 2005 that there was an agenda to actually make carbon cost. They created a carbon emissions futures product.
So you've been aware of it for a long time.
Oh yeah, and I think this is just another move by the bankers to taxes. It's an indulgence. It's like during the Middle Ages.
I agree. It's an indulgence, but it's going to impoverish the least well off the most. Maria, thank you so much. Glyn is with us from Nottingham. I hope it's sunnier in Nottingham, Glyn. Good afternoon.
Not really. It's a bit dull and damp.
Oh dear. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the show. What would you like to say?
Just a couple of quick points. First off, on Boris thing and the parties, they obviously weren't that scared. At the time they were telling us not to kill your granny, they were partying, and I include Labour in this because they were obviously as bad as the Tories. They were partying away whilst telling us not to go near anybody. I didn't see my grandchildren, and I know this is small potatoes to some people, for about 10 months because they live 150 miles away and we couldn't go.
No, but you're absolutely right. But it's not small potatoes. It's really important. Those family links. And that's the point. Why were they trying to terrify and lock up the whole population when they weren't afraid of the virus themselves and they weren't locking up themselves?
Well, it's one very simple reason for that. In one word, control. They wanted control and they got it one way or another. But the other thing I wanted to mention was with this net zero thing, my energy bill has just gone up from the 1st of January by over 60%.
Wow.
And that's before they removed the cap. Now, I'm assuming once they remove the cap, it's going to go up again.
I'm afraid it is. So you've just had a fixed contract that's come to an end, so you're back onto the variable tariff.
That's right, yeah. I mean, and it's gone up by a lot. Well, it's over 60%. That we can't... I'm retired. I can't do extra overtime or anything like that to pay the bill. I've got a set amount of income per year, per month, whatever you want to term it.
So, I mean, that's really that's really putting you on the squeeze then.
Well, we're lucky. There's the two of us, and we've both got pensions, so we can cope. But you can't keep putting up with 60% increases all the time. I mean, the thing is ridiculous.
It's a failure. It's a total failure of government policy over a long period of time, and it's hitting. It's hitting people like yourself, pensioners, the least well off, the lower paid, the most.
Yeah, you see, I don't think it's so much a government policy, it's a Boris and Carrie policy. I think to a certain extent, I don't know this, but she's got an awful lot to answer for because he seems to be led round by his nose.
Well, the reality is that ultimately, he's entitled to listen to whoever's advice he wants to. But it's on his call. He's the elected guy. He's at the top. He's the one. You listen to the advice, a range of different places, but then you've got to make the call. You've got to make the judgment. And I think many people feel he's made the wrong judgment. You'll like this tweet that's just come in, Glyn. It says, Boris has thrown a dead cat called Barry Gardner on the table and you mugs fell for it.
Well, he's just... I don't know what you can do about it unless he's got to go one way or another. And
when do you want him to go, Glyn, lastly?
But now, give him time to recoup. It's very unedifying for him to see him being dragged kicking and screaming. It would be far more dignified for him to come out and say, look, basically I've cocked it up, I've done the wrong thing, therefore I'll pay the price, it's my responsibility, I'm going. Rather than all this, it was a work, mind you, as I say, Keir Starmer's as bad. It was a works party, he said.
Well, but of course, Glyn, it was only one beer, wasn't it?
Well,
supposedly.
It's a party.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Glyn, thank you very much for those thoughts.
Thank you.
That was Glyn in Nottingham with his views. All the tweets and messages coming in. We're running out of time to take any more calls, but I'm back next Sunday, of course, so don't hesitate to give us a call. Then one more message just come in. What about the risk to the UK of China buying 10% of Heathrow Airport? Another one from Carl. He said, no, I've already read that one out. I've been distracted because actually what's happened, the truth is that Bob Mills has just breezed into this studio, beautifully attired as always. How are you, sir? Good
very
afternoon.
well, lovely, great show, well done.
You've brought slightly better weather with you compared to this first when I started. Goodness me.
It was horrible, wasn't it?
Horrible. What's going on?
Well, we've got a lot going on the show. The only thing people really need to know about, for gentlemen of our generation, we've got a man who's written a history of the Rickenbacker guitar.
Wow.
I'll sit here for 3 hours, quite happily, and let him talk.
Right, okay.
That would do me a treat. The guest who's written a history of the electric guitar, mate, the stage is set for you.
The stage is set. Where do you go from there?
Well, exactly. I'm sure we've got loads of stuff after that. We always finish with live music. We've got Heather Smalls coming in, all sorts of nice things.
All sorts. You've got people coming into the studio. Mine were on the Zoom. We couldn't find them. It was all sorts.
Yeah.
But you know, that's fine. That's fine. But we've been talking about, we've gone all over the world. We've had listeners from China, from Japan. We've been talking about China. We've been talking about, what's been going on in Parliament with Barry Gardiner receiving hundreds of thousands of pounds, whether or not Boris should stay or go.
What's the word on Novak? What's the general feeling amongst your people with Novak?
The general feeling, I think, well, he's gone.
Yeah.
I think the general feeling is that Australia's lost the plot, but equally,
really?
he didn't help himself because he didn't fill the forms out
properly. He didn't fill the form in, and I think, surely the first rule of any government of any country is to decide who comes in and who doesn't,
exactly.
protect its own borders.
It's their sovereign right. I think the point is that a lot of concerns that actually they've just made the wrong judgments, but it is their call, isn't it?
I heard someone very, very quickly on one of the radio stations this morning saying, why do the governments get involved in sport? No. It's nothing to do with the government getting involved in sport. Why does sport think it can override the government?
Yes, no, absolutely. It's this point about actually you've got to comply with whatever rules the government of the nation sets, whether or not you like them. And I don't agree with almost anything that Australia's done to do with COVID
That's
recently.
the point.
That's the point. Don't go anywhere, folks. That's Bob Mills coming up after the top of the hour. You've been a fantastic audience listening.